So welcome everyone. This is an online presentation as part of the International Herb Symposium. So let's bring up the logo for that. And here we are online doing recording a couple months before the actual symposium. And I regret not seeing you all in person in June. It's such a wonderful event in person at Wheaton College, and I'm sorry for that. So here is the best facsimile that we can come up with for a program that originally was going to be offered as part of the symposium that would have a hands-on component where we'd pass out seeds of native plants to everyone and have you sow them and take them home and grow them and plant them. So I'm very sorry that we can't have that actual live component of this program, but at least we can do the first part, which is to let you all know about these wonderful native and edible plants that are available for us to add to our landscapes. So I want to thank Kelsey and United Plant Savers for hosting this recording of this PowerPoint presentation. And I want to thank our audience that are invited to take part in this taping. Candace, Mary, Nancy, Jasmine, and Georgia, thank you very much for being part of this. And I just want to say before I start that the focus of tonight's presentation is on plants that are native to the Northeast US that are edible by people. Now, a lot of these plants have medicinal values too, but since I'm not an herbalist, I'm not going to dwell very much on that aspect. I'll probably mention it if I know about it, and I'll count on you experts out there, including I'm sure many people that are watching this webinar, will be able to fill in those details. So I yield to your expertise there. And let me also just say before we start that the focus of this talk is on small scale growing. It's what each of us as individuals can do in our own yards or in partnership with other folks that own properties nearby that could use some diversification with native edible species. So it's not about how to run a business. It's not about, large scale commercialization. It's basically what each of us can do on a small scale basis in our yards. All right, so with that, let's start the show. So, of course, it's important to acknowledge the presence of Native Americans in the Northeast. And here is a screenshot from a wonderful website, an interactive website that attempts to show where all the Native American territories are. Now, these are historic territories. A lot of members of the tribes that are still around, they may not be in the original tribal homelands, but yet they still have strong connections to the places where they are, as do many of us as well. So thank you so much to them. And I want to do a specific plant-based acknowledgement too, besides talking about territory. And that is to talk about the fact that much of the knowledge that I'm going to share tonight was originally figured out by the indigenous people spending the time with the plants, connecting to the plants for many thousands of years before people like me were on the scene. So I'm very grateful that that knowledge has trickled down to me, and I've been able to supplement that with almost 5 decades of personal experience interacting with these plants too. And if there was any resources in particular I'd like to single out as being really inspirational, and that is, well, Robin Wall Kimmerer in general is a great person and very eloquent in all her writings and all her speeches. But this book that she wrote, Braiding Sweetgrass, it's terrific. I've read it several times, and it's just very helps you see the world in a different way. From the plant's perspective, from the Native Americans' perspective. It's just, I encourage you all to read it if you haven't read that. All right, so let's start with the show. Oh, I forgot about this slide, really important slide. So this is a whole chapter in Robin's book, Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about how to harvest in an ethical way. And she even suggests in her book that people consider like laminating a card with this these directives on there, which I think is worth considering. But I just wanted to say, even Robin would admit that this is a guideline. It's a general guideline. As we talk about specific species, and I get into the show, I will talk about where So you see, for example, she says here, never take more than half. I mean, that's way more for some species, and for some other species, you can take more than half. So it just depends on the individual species. We'll get into those details later. But anyway, since the theme of tonight's talk is on native plants often have important roles in the environment. Animals rely upon them for food to some other important portions of the life cycle. So it's important, if you're gathering plants from the wild, to bear that in mind, and to employ a lot of forbearance and restraint, just to make sure that you don't upset the ecological balance in any way. But depending upon the part of the plant you're harvesting, there are going to be different impacts. For example, picking berries and nuts, those are relatively benign foraging activities because all you're gathering is the seed dispersal portion of the organism, and there's often a lot of those around, and it's okay to take a good amount. If you are, though, digging plants up to harvest them and stripping all the flowers, all the leaves off to plants to harvest them, you can imagine that could be a lot more traumatic for the plant, so keep that in mind. So we will start the show talking about the ecological significance of native plants, and then we will quickly transfer to the edible news. All right, so here's the ecological argument. So there's a guy named Doug Tallamy. There he is. The way that I describe him is I say that he's kind of the analog to the people like Bill McKibben and Al Gore in terms of what they've done to raise the public consciousness about climate change and our need for us to deal with it. That's what Doug Tallamy has done for native plants, because he's an entomologist from the University of Delaware, and he made a very astute observation that our birds, our migrating songbirds, when they fly up north and they've built their nests and they lay their eggs, the eggs hatch and little babies are clamoring for food. What are those parent birds feeding them? They're feeding them caterpillars. And where are the birds finding those caterpillars? They're finding them on the native plants. Now, why is that? The reason is, since plants can't move, one of their major defenses against being eaten to death is chemical. And the non-native plants haven't been around long enough for the native insects to figure out how to eat them. And so they're not there. And so they're kind of like a food desert. The equivalent of a food desert to a bird is a place with a lot of non-native plants in it. So that's why Doug says it's really important to plant native. And he is the leading a movement in this way. So that's his first book. Here's one of his more recent books. And there's been documentaries about him, and he gives lots of speeches. He's really getting out there, getting the word out, which is great. And so a lot of people have been motivated to plant natives in their yards based on what they've learned from Doug. And lots of organizations are getting into the act. You know, the states are putting out guidelines to what are the native plants, where to find them. A lot of the nonprofits have these great websites, and it's all talking about the ecological reasons to plant native plants. And this is all really good, really important. All right, so let me tell you a story that happened at the Ecological Landscape Alliance conference about 5 years ago, where a wonderful woman named Kate Vettoriti was speaking. And Kate at the time was meeting with homeowners along the shore in Narragansett Bay, and her objective was to get them to plant native plants in their yard to act as a buffer to help absorb the pollutants coming off the roadways and the lawns and stuff like that, to help keep the water clean in Narragansett Bay. And as part of her talk, she had this slide. And this is a slide that should be familiar to all of you, at least this kind of a format, where you see the name of the plants on the left side, and then on the right side you have all these columns talking about various attributes like grows tall, grows short, like sun, like shade, and so on. So after Kate's talk was done, I went up to her and I said, "Kate, where's your edibility column?" And she said, "Oh, we don't tell people that." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "We don't want people to eat these plants. We want them to leave them for the wildlife." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. You have blueberry on your list. Are you suggesting that people plant blueberries and then never go out and pick a blueberry themselves?" "Oh, we wouldn't do that." Well, then I said, "You might as well tell them what else is edible." So now in Rhode Island, they do. Based on information they got from me, they now have an edibility column. And here's the point of this show. The fact that many of our native species are edible by people too provides an additional powerful incentive to people to plant them that aren't convinced on just the pure ecological argument. So pardon me while I dwell on stereotypes for just a minute. So in my mind, I imagine a husband and wife with a house, nice lot, and the wife has heard Doug Tallamy's talk, or she's read Doug Tallamy's book, and she's convinced, hey, it's really important. We got to go native. We got to plant native in our yard. And the husband says, I like the yard the way it is. I don't want to change anything. And that's when she can find out, maybe through this talk, about all the native plants that are edible by people too. And it's the what's in it for me angle. Now, I know it's not going to get everybody to rip out their lawn and put in native plants, but my feeling is that the fact that many of our native species are edible by people too will convince an additional, perhaps significant group of people to do it that aren't necessarily sold in just the pure ecological argument. So that is the theme of this workshop session. So let's talk a little bit more about how do you know if a plant is native? Well, in New England, we have this wonderful website called Go Botany, produced by the Native Plant Trust, that shows you if a plant is native or not. And the Go Botany includes all the plants in New England, including the non-native and invasive ones. But where it's native, you see here is a map of New England with county outlines on it. And you'll see where they're colored in green. That means that species has been documented to occur as a native plant in that area. So if you want to keep your nose clean with all your ecologist friends and you consult this source and you only plant things that have already been documented to occur as native plants in your county, you have a very good source to rely on in this Go Botany webpage. And then Arthur Haynes's book is rather dense, but for the serious botanist, that's a good site. And yeah, for other Northeast states too, there's a wonderful New York Flora Atlas, the Pennsylvania Flora Project. So you should be able to find good resource materials that tells you, is a plant native? Then here's something that some people like to pay attention to, and that is ecoregion. Because of course, plants are paying attention to political boundaries where they decide where to grow. No, they're growing in the kind of habitats that they like, and that's a combination of climate and soil type and elevation and stuff like that. And so some people feel strongly that it's important that you plant local eco-type plants, plants that that come from the place where you are. And I've heard some healthy debate about that amongst the botany people and the native plant people. Let me just say that I think an argument can be made that if you are able to source local eco-type seeds, local eco-type plants, the chances of that plant doing well in your area because it's from that area is greater than if it's from somewhere else. But there's a lot of cases I know that people have trouble tracking down local eco-type seed. Here is one place to get local eco-type seed, though. There's a wonderful nonprofit organization in Maine called the Wild Seed Project, run by my friend Heather McCargo. And this is a seed company, but all she sells is local eco-type, mainly to southern Maine, seeds in these little seed packets. And this website here, wildseedproject.net, has really great instructions for how to grow plants from seed, which we're not going to get into a lot of details with in this show tonight. So that's a great place to go if you want more information. All right, and if you want to know, well, what would work in my yard or on this property that I'd like to do something, here's a really great resource, Plant Finder, maintained by the Native Plant Trust. It does so much of the work for you. So you just click the boxes that describe the kind of plant you want or the kind of habitat you have, and then up magically pops the things that you're interested in. So I'm interested in edible plants. So I said, tell me everything that's edible. So I clicked the edible box here, and 80 results came up, which is pretty good. There's actually more than 180 species that are native to Northeast ecoregions that are edible by people, but 80 is a pretty good representative sample. All right, so then if you click on one of these images, and for the sake of this talk, I clicked on the sweet fern. So up pops the sweet fern page, and you can see colored in green the areas where sweet fern is native to, and some more details about the kind of habitat that sweet fern likes and stuff like that. So really great resource. All right, so now that we've talked about all these preliminaries, it's time to get to some specific plants. So let's dive right in. And I'm going to admit to a prejudice I've not been able to overcome in the organization of the plants for this talk. The plants are organized by foraging opportunity. And that does not make sense to, let's say, a landscape architect who's thinking about, I want to know what works in dry sites. I want to know what works on wet sites. And I just don't think that way. I think about what can I eat now? And so I'm starting the show with stuff that's available now, and then we'll go through the entire growing season. And I've clumped a little bit thing to, I've put a few wetland plants together. You'll see that, but mostly it's spring through fall. So let's start the show. Okay, so here is obviously a little clump of fiddleheads. This is not enough to know if that are the edible fiddleheads. And here's a mistake. Now, some of you in the audience may know this species really well, but in Eastern Mass, where I'm from, really common mistake by novice foragers is we walk in the woods in the spring and they'll see a bunch of ferns at the curled up fiddlehead stage, and they'll say to themselves, oh, fiddleheads, boy, that looks an awful lot like what I've seen for sale in the stores. It must be the same thing. And so they pick it and they bring it home and they cook it up and it tastes horrible. And they say, oh, where do I go wrong? Well, where they went wrong is they harvested the wrong species of fern. So I only know of 2 species of fern that taste good and only one that's safe to eat in quantity, and that's this one. This is the Ostrich Fern. This is, in fact, the Fiddlehead Fern, the one that you do see for sale in the stores. And on that subject, as far as I know, nobody is cultivating the Ostrich Fern in terms of cropping it to sell at a store. And so when you see an ostrich fern, like on a restaurant menu or in a produce store, it was gathered from the wild. And it is possible to do that scrupulously, and I'll explain that in just a second. But unfortunately, what happens is when people start looking at plants as dollar signs and they think of plants as an article commerce, I think it changes the relationship with their plants and they pick too much. So what I consider a sustainable level of harvest with the ostrich fern fiddleheads is if you pick 1 or maybe 2 of the curled up parts per clump. And by the way, I would cut it right there. So all this stem is good eating too. You don't have to take just the curled up part. So I'd cut it right there and then take the above part there. So 1 to 2 per clump, let the rest grow out. And that's a totally sustainable harvest level. The ferns could absolutely handle that. But unfortunately, what some of the unscrupulous people do, and this is mainly people picking to sell the plants, is that they'll just pick everything. And that saps a lot of strength from the plant. Scientific studies have proven that you can actually kill a ostrich fern by harvesting it so hard. So just 1 or 2. That's the forbearance and restraint that I was talking about that is so eloquently described in Robin's book. And also on the subject of Native Americans, I have to talk about one other thing. So there's a concept I heard that it's actually a colonialist settler term, but it has some value, and that is a term called TEK, which stands for Traditional Ecological Knowledge, which of course Native Americans, being with these plants for so many thousands of years, developed a really, really deep knowledge. And it shows up sometimes in the language. And here's a really cool example of that. And I learned this from Nancy Turner, an ethnobotanist who's actually from British Columbia, but she made an observation that the Maliseet Indians call ostrich fern, and I apologize for not getting the pronunciation right if I get it wrong, masos, which refers to the circling movement a dog makes as it lies down. Isn't that cool? So here's a circling thing, the vase shape of the mature fronds. And of course, here's a circling movement right here, the fiddlehead itself. So isn't it such an apt description? All right, so where do you find ostrich fern in the wild? I typically find them in a alluvial floodplain soil, which you'd see along some of our major rivers. So it doesn't mean that ostrich fern will only grow in this kind of habitat. This is the kind of place where you see it growing. And so if you are seeing a fern that you think is ostrich fern and it's growing on top of a hill or in a really rocky area, it's probably something else. All right, and then here is that ostrich fern in the vase-shaped clump as it fully unrolls like this. And here's another way to identify ostrich fern, the fertile fronds, the spore-bearing fronds that you often see at the base of the plant. So not every clump of ostrich ferns will have these, but it's common to see them in the patch of ostrich ferns. And like I said, in the clump of fiddleheads that I showed you before, If you cut this stem in cross section of the fertile frond, it also makes a U shape because there's a gouge running down this center like a celery stalk, and that's true with all these at the fiddlehead stage and the mature fronds. All right, so if you have ever bought fiddleheads at the store, brought them home, cooked them up, and been not pretty impressed with them, here's the reason, the probable reason why, and that is because those fiddleheads have been sitting around too long in the produce department. You need to think of fiddleheads like sweet corn and minimize the amount of time between the time when you harvest them and the time you eat them. And this was aptly demonstrated by this naturalist, Beth Basler, who took a bunch of us to a patch of ostrich fern fiddleheads growing along the Connecticut River in the town of Northfield. And she brought her camp stove with her to the fiddlehead patch. And we were eating those fiddleheads 10 minutes after we picked them. And they were truly exquisite that way. So that is the secret to getting some really tasty fiddleheads. All right, and so now I mentioned where you see fiddleheads ordinarily in the wild, but it's actually a pretty versatile plant. So this is just the edge of somebody's yard in suburban Boston. You can see the non-native English ivy poking around here. So ostrich fern will spread vegetatively. So you get a few established and then the clump will just spread on its own. And a lot of people, I don't know for sure, but I would wager that the homeowner that put these in doesn't even know that these are the edible fiddlehead ostrich ferns, and they just put them in because they like the way they look. So there's another view of the same property. So it's a plant that is a handsome addition to a landscape, even if you didn't eat it, but of course you can eat it. All right, so here is another plant that's just about at this stage in the Boston area where I'm talking to you from. This is the marsh marigold. And this is an edible plant, but not after the flowers come out. You want to harvest it before the flowers come out, and it's the leaves that are edible, and you can't eat them raw. You have to boil them at least once. Some people would say twice, just to make sure you get out all the toxic properties in the leaves. And then the leaves are have a lot of substance to them, so they won't get all limp and mushy after all that boiling. And they do taste like spinach. And you might say to yourself, I think I'll just go and buy spinach or grow it in the yard. And that's fine, because of course this is a beautiful wildflower. And so in order to use forbearance and restraint in gathering this one, I'm saying just pick 1 or 2 leaves per plant. That's it. Leave the rest of the leaves attached to the plant. And that's a sustainable way of harvesting the plant to eat it. And I mentioned this maybe not so much for practical edibility reasons, but more for the historical interest, because this plant, along with the ostrich fern, are plants that Native Americans ate, that folks in rural areas ate, especially before the widespread advent of refrigeration after World War II, when people were living off plants from their root cellar or plants they had canned and put up over the wintertime. In the spring, they were really desperate to get some green and growing plants, and things were being shipped in from California back then. So they would go out into the countryside and find that things were already green. And some of our herbaceous perennials like ostrich fern and marsh marigold offered early opportunities to eat green plants. So this one is a fun plant to grow. I've done it. It's I've had mixed success. Some years I can grow dozens of plants, and other years I can't grow a single one, but I would consider it fairly easily. So you want to keep your eye on these seeds, because the seeds are at a collectible stage for less than a week. And so it's in early June in the Boston area. You gather those seeds and you can sow them right away, or you can store them in a plastic bag and sow them later. Yeah, so here's a scene from my little nursery where I was able to grow a bunch of these marsh marigold plants from seeds. So I encourage you to try it. Okay, so here's another native species. Yes, Nancy.
I was just wondering, so there's an invasive plant that looks very much like the
Yes.
Lactouchican, and it grows in stitches that I know of. How do you tell the difference between the two?
Yeah, so the marsh marigold leaves are about 3 or 4 times the size of the invasive one. And the marsh marigold leaves are on stalks, probably like 4 or 5 inches long. The other one you're talking about, I think it's called a fig buttercup, is one of the nicknames for it. And it does have the shiny green leaves and the yellow flowers, and it is an invasive species. Yes, so the marsh marigold is the flowers are about the same size, but the leaves are much, much bigger than the marsh marigold, and they're on the green stalks. So that's how I would tell it apart.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks for the question. All right. So this species is one that I bet most people watching this PowerPoint have heard of if you haven't actually found it in the wild. So this is a native species to the Northeast and the Midwest. It's a species that Native Americans utilized extensively. In fact, the names for the two cities, Chicago and Winooski, Vermont, are believed to be derived from Native American, the tribal terms for the plants in those areas. And this is a plant that, the colonists and the people, the Europeans settling the countryside found out about. And it was pretty common for folks to gather a few while they're out in the spring, turkey hunting, trout fishing, stuff like that. And all of that was fine. However, what happened about 15 years ago is this plant began to experience a meteoric rise in popularity as the chefs and the foodies started hyperventilating about it. And they called this plant ramps, which is the Southern Appalachian name. The actual New England, Northeast US name is wild leek. And that's how it was known until the foodies took over and started calling it ramps. And so what has happened since this plant has experienced this meteoric rise in popularity is there's a bit of a gold rush mentality that has happened on the part of some people where they go into the woods and they'll look for a patch of the wild leeks like this. They'll take up every single plant and not leave a single one behind. So obviously that's not a sustainable way of gathering this plant. So let me tell you a little bit about the kind of habitat that the wild leek likes to grow in. So I gave a talk in New Hampshire, virtual talk, a couple weeks ago. And when it came time for the Q&A session, they said, ramps, where are ramps? We want ramps. And I said, actually, ramps are considered a rare species in New Hampshire because you're the granite state. You have very acidic soil. Ramps don't like that soil. They like to grow in a more neutral soil, more higher pH. And where you're more likely to find them are places where you have the limestone or marble-based bedrock. And so that's mostly in Western New England where you're going to encounter these, or further west from there. And so, yes, so here is a patch of the wild leeks coming up in the spring. This is your classic spring ephemeral because it does all its leafing out and stuff before the trees leaf out. And it likes the same kind of habitat as a lot of our cherished wildflowers, like the trilliums and the bloodroots. And here you see the Dutchman's breeches coming out. A similar preference for that rich soil. And this is, at least in New England, it's not considered a very common habitat. And so the habitat itself is special. It needs to be protected. And what can happen if somebody goes in and just digs up all these wild leeks and they leave any bare soil behind? They're creating the ideal growing medium for the garlic mustard and the other invasive species to establish a toehold in these sensitive rich woods habitats. So that's not good either. All right. So let's get to some good news about this plant. So here's a close-up of what the plants look like. And you see each plant has 2, sometimes 3 leaves. The good news is the leaves are delicious. You don't have to dig up a ramp to eat it. You just enjoy the leaves. In fact, the advice I've been trying to get out to people, to all the chefs and the foodies and everybody interacting with this plant in the wild, is please consider confining your harvesting to leaves only. And ideally, it should just be 1 leaf per plant. Leave the remaining leaf, attach the bulb, leave the bulb in the ground. That's a sustainable way of interacting with this plant. Then the patches continue to thrive into the future, and that's good. Because this is unfortunately what I'm seeing out there in the commercial land where the wild leeks have become articles of commerce. So here's the picture from a gift shop at a really famous restaurant, Blue Hill at Stone Barns restaurant. This is Dan Barber's restaurant, where he's not even incorporating the little ramp bulbs on his menu. He's just pickling them and selling them at his gift shop. To me, these plants were unnecessarily dug up. And even the food co-ops were selling the ramps with the bulbs attached. And so this was not good. And of course, Whole Foods is doing it too. So there they are, the roots attached. So these are plants that, this is not a sustainable way of interacting with these plants. So I have to tell you a quick story. So I've been on a soapbox for over a decade about this, trying to enlighten people about how to responsibly interact with this plant. Because it's a delicious plant. You just don't have to dig it up. So a few years ago when I was still working, I get an email to my work email address and the subject line is wild ramps. And I thought, oh, great. Some foodie has tracked me down and wants me to divulge the location of some patch of wild leeks so they can go plunder it. And it turned out that email was from the produce manager of the Hunger Mountain Food Co-op, which is the one serving Montpelier, Vermont. And he was writing to tell me that based on what they had learned from me, they had decided to sell only very small bags of 1 leaf per plant only, wild leek leaves. And he wanted my permission to put a little message from me inside each bag to say why that was a good idea. So I was very grateful that he did that. So that's a piece of good news. All right, and here's some more good news. You can propagate wild leeks. So here is a photo from one of the stock beds at the Native Plant Trust Garden in the Woods. This is in Framingham, Mass., a suburb of Boston, where they really cram the stock beds full of these wild leek plants, and then they're able to extract a minor percentage of them. And these plants aren't sold like this at restaurants. They get potted up and they're sold as live plants for people to plant in their own yards. And so here's a great way if you want to say, well, where can I ethically get some ramp plants to establish myself? You can buy them from Garden of the Woods or their Western Mass counterpart, Nasami Farm, and they'll sell you plants all potted up in little pots, and then you can plant them in your yard and establish your own ramp patch in your own yard. And then, of course, you could harvest it how you wanted to, but my guess is that you're not going to dig those plants up because that would be like killing the goose that laid the golden egg. Instead, you just pick the leaves and enjoy them and leave the bulbs in the ground so you'd continue to have crop year after year after year. All right, so that's enough about the wild leek. Okay, so here is a plant called carrion flower that is a distant cousin of asparagus, and you cook it and eat it just like asparagus. So it is a close relative of catbrier. And instead of having thorns and being really woody, it's herbaceous. So here is the dried up growth from last year's catbrier plants. Here's a few remaining berries from last year's berry crop. And this plant in May sends up shoots that look just like asparagus. You harvest it like asparagus. You cook it like asparagus. It tastes like asparagus. It's related to asparagus. So why is it called carrion flower? So here we are camping, and these little flower buds here are the unopened flowers, about to open flowers of the carrion flower. Here's what happens when they open. They look like this. And then that's when you discover why it's called carrion flower. Because if you stick your nose right up to that, you can get whiplash from the reaction because it smells like really strong, dirty gym socks or rotting meat, because this plant is pollinated by carrion flies. So I can certainly understand if you're a homeowner, maybe you don't want to have carrion flower growing in your yard because, I mean, the flowers don't last long. They last for, like a couple weeks at most. But even so, I could understand how you don't want it. But here's why some people might want to plant carrion flower, because there are other plants they're growing that use carrion flies as the chief pollinator, and pawpaws is the chief one. So permaculturists in particular are very excited about pawpaws. So those of you that know the United Plant Savers group and its homeland down in Southeast Ohio know that's pawpaw country. Athens, Ohio has a pawpaw festival every year in September. Pawpaws do grow in New England. In fact, there's a good-sized patch very close to where I live outside of Boston that produces fruit that's edible. Pawpaws aren't native to New England, is that they weren't here, without any human intervention. But with climate change and our habitats getting increasingly temperate, this is a species that now will grow here, and that's what the fruit looks like, and it's really yummy. It tastes like custard. I unfortunately am allergic to pawpaws. I get a rash in my face when I eat them, so it's a shame. But I'm happy to grow them. I have some growing in my nursery, and it is a plant that also, I don't have a picture of a pawpaw flower here, but they are pollinated by carrion flies, which is why some permaculturists that are growing pawpaw grow carrion flower too, to help provide an additional food source for the carrion flies. All right, so let's talk about wild lettuce. So there are several different varieties of wild lettuce. They're all edible. It's just some are bitter. And I think if I click on this, Yeah, so there's the bitter one. So the bitter one has leaves that are very fat and broad at the end. And the non-bitter one is this one right here. This is Lactouchican Canadensis, where the terminal lobes are skinny like a finger. And this wild lettuce is quite mild and just about as good as cultivated lettuce, even after it begins to bolt like this. So eventually it's going to get bitter too, but at the rosette stage, it's yummy and nice and mild. And even after it bolts, it's nice and mild like this. And this is one that you can grow from seed. So there's the wild lettuce seed. It goes to seed in September, and you can gather that seed and sow it right away or store it. You don't have to, as far as I know, I store it dry, and I don't think you have to stratify it. You don't have to keep it cold. And then just sow it in the spring. And here's my mom, who part of my nursery that I'll talk about a little bit later in the show is at my mom's house. My mom occasionally pitches in and helps me with my plants. So, all right. So here is a native species with some considerable food value and medicinal value. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It is among the harder plants to recognize. Do any of you know what this plant is?
Primrose?
Right, very good, Nancy. This is evening primrose. And evening primrose is a biennial, and it has a 2-year life cycle. So the first year, all you see is this. In the beginning of the second year, which is this photo is taken, is all you see is this. It's just a rosette of leaves. I noticed this prominent white midrib on some of the leaves. And the main edible part on an evening primrose is the root. And the best time to harvest a root for all biennial species is at the end of the first year or the beginning of the second year. So that period. So there's the flower. So that's what the plant will do eventually. It's going to get 3 feet or more tall and produce these flowers. And the flowers are edible too, by the way. But the main part where you can really fill up is the root. And this root is about as big as a carrot, and it is whitish, with this pink coloration near the top that's very diagnostic for the evening primrose. And so far, my favorite way to use evening primrose is to make pancakes with it, like potato pancakes. So you can just grate up an equivalent amount of the evening primrose root in whatever recipe you use potato pancakes. You can just substitute the evening primrose root for the potatoes, and it should work great. So, so this plant, let me see if I can go back here. Oh, no, there's a slide of the seed. I'll talk about that in a second. All right. Oh, I want to talk about the seed. Sorry about that. So yeah, so if you wanted to propagate evening primrose from seed, it's very easy to do. This is what the seed heads look like. There are thousands of evening primrose seeds in these seed heads. And this one I gathered by a parking lot by a church. So you don't have to be way off in the wilderness to find this plant. It is a weed, but it is a native weed. It's a native plant to the Northeast. So, and this is a native plant with a lot of food value. So I would say one of the horticultural varieties of evening primrose is probably lovelier to look at. This one is a bit rank the way it grows. But if you want to grow native, this would be a good choice. And there are insect species like moths and stuff that are associate specifically with evening primrose. So you'd be nurturing them by growing this plant. So the seeds are the source of evening primrose oil, which has some medicinal values. It's high in omega-3 fatty acids. And I have been told that the small scale that I'm operating at, where, I'm gathering, maybe if I really go at it, I might gather several ounces worth of seeds, that you're not going to be able to press any oil out of such a little amount of seeds. So, but I will mention, this is the same plant that evening primrose oil comes from. Okay, milkweed. So there's an ecological story to milkweed that I'll get to next, but first I want to talk about the edible part. So I wrote a book about foraging, and I'll mention that at the end of the talk, but the subtitle of the chapter on milkweed in the book is Procrastinating Foraging. These 4 edible stages to the plant, and they happen chronologically in succession. So if you mess up and miss a stage, you just wait a while till the next edible stage develops. So here is actually stage number 3, the flower buds in the tight green cluster, they're edible. Before this stage, the young shoots are edible, and the leaves off the slightly older shoots are edible. Now, there is a cooking method that I recommend for all parts of the milkweed, and that is to boil it for 7 minutes. So, and because there is a slight toxic property to milkweed, but it's completely dispelled by that cooking, and milkweed will not shrink or get all mushy on you even after all that boiling. So look at the milkweed flower buds in this bowl here. These have been boiled for 7 minutes. If anything, they look at least as nice as they did on the plant. So you could eat these just as a plain vegetable, just like that, or you could incorporate them into different dishes. Like here's a recipe from my book, Milkweed Egg Puff, which is like between a souffle and a casserole, where the milkweed buds work really well on that. And even the pods, the milkweed pods, when they're up to an inch long, you can boil them for 7 minutes, and the texture and the flavor is really similar to green beans. Okay, now the ecological story. So here is the monarch butterfly caterpillar to remind us that yes, this is indeed one of the milkweed species that the monarch butterflies seek out to lay their eggs on, and the caterpillars eat the leaves and so on. And by the way, let me just remember to say at this point, it's only the common milkweed around here that's edible. In the Northeast is the only edible milkweed species. So swamp milkweed isn't edible, butterfly weed isn't edible, just the common milkweed. All right, so, but even so, it's really important for there to be lots and lots of milkweed plants around for the monarchs to make sure that they can find the caterpillar food. So here is how I am helping to, the reciprocity. This is something that Robin Kimmerer talks about in her book, develop relationship and reciprocity with plants. So here is my version of reciprocity to the milkweed. Besides propagating in my nursery and distributing the plants to other people and passing out seeds and stuff like that, here's what I'm doing at my house. So here's my house, and here's the house in the back. Here's my car with a boat on it. Here are the blueberry bushes we've got growing on the edge of the driveway. We've let the milkweed grow in the midst of the blueberries, and they come up profusely in the spring. And so we're able to harvest multiple crops of the milkweed shoots as they're first coming up, boil them for 7 minutes, delicious vegetable. And that's great. And these plants are so prolific that you can recrop them several times, like asparagus. It's not a problem at all. They'll come right back. They'll come right back. So we have some delicious milkweed meals. So when do I stop harvesting the milkweeds next to my driveway? This is what I do. I go to a website called Journey North, which is a citizen science project where citizens are tracking the northward migration of monarchs from their wintering grounds in Mexico. And they plot little dots in a map of the United States to show how the monarchs are migrating north. And when the first reports come that the monarchs have arrived in Massachusetts, that's when I stop harvesting the milkweed, and I leave it for the monarchs at that point. But in the meantime, we get lots of delicious meals out of it. And I've even been able to dig up dozens of plants from this same patch, pot them up, and then plant them out elsewhere. So milkweed's a good plant in many ways. Oh yeah, so here is the butterfly found our milkweed plants. So here's the net we put over our blueberries, and the monarch butterfly found our plants and laid the eggs on it. We know that because here's the chrysalis attached to the garage door right next to where the milkweed plants were. And fortunately, the butterfly was smart enough to attach to a hinge on the door, so when the door goes up and down, it didn't hurt the chrysalis. So the butterfly matured, and one day we came out and looked, and this was empty, and the butterfly had flown away. All right, so here is basswood. That is the Native American version of plants in the Tilia genus. In our environment, especially anybody that lives in a city, you're also likely to run into Tilia Cordata, which is the little leaf linden, which is a European linden, which is equally edible to the basswood. So in both cases, you can eat the young leaves when they first come out. They're very tender. You can eat them raw. And you can make a tea from the flowers. The flowers come out around the first day of summer in the greater Boston area. The tea has a wonderful lemon, honey, fragrance, and flavor. And the tea has two medicinal uses. So here's another case of a plant that is edible medicinal. The linden tea is soothing to your digestive system and to your mental state at the same time. So I've heard from herbalists that are very keen on this plant for that reason. So here is the basswood. I have grown this one from seed in my nursery. It is not an easy plant. You have to sow a lot of seeds to get any plants, but I have done it. And I've also just bought seedling plants from other ethical growers and then had it in my nursery to be able to plant out in other places. So that's our basswood. And one other thing I should mention is, now, a lot of people, besides hearing plant native, it's really important to do that. Another message we keep hearing these days is plant for pollinators, plant for pollinators. Well, people tend to think about, the herbaceous perennials in the yard, like the flowers that get a couple feet tall. Well, some trees have flowers that pollinators like, and the basswood is a great example of that. When this tree is blooming, it's covered from top to bottom with blossoms, and these trees can get to be 40 or 50 feet tall. And you can hear the tree before you see it when the flowers are blooming, because there are so many bees and other insects working the blossoms. You hear their buzzing before you actually see the tree. All right, so this is a scene we should be able to see very, very soon in the Boston area, and a week or two later in northern New England. And this is the Shad Bush blooming, also called Juneberry. And this is the best time to spot where the plants grow in the wild, because they're very easy to see when they're covered with these showy white 5-petal blossoms, because when the fruit is ripe, it's hard to see at a distance. So, and I will show that in just a second. All right, so here's the fruit. So the fruit is ripe when it's this purple color. So this red fruit is not quite ripe. And it's called Juneberry because the fruit is ripe toward the end of June in southern New England. In northern New England, it probably should be called July berry because it's not really ripe yet in June. And these individual berries are about the size of blueberries, and they kind of look like blueberries, but they don't really taste like blueberries. They taste like a cross between cherries and almonds, which is not surprising once you find out that they're related to cherries and almonds. They're all related plants in the rose family. So this tree, I mentioned spotting it in the wild, but this is one of our most common native species planted in parks and other landscaped areas because it's an early bloomer and because it has this fruit which is small and not messy, and people that manage parks like that. They don't want to do a lot of cleanup. So anyway, and the birds, the songbirds, love this fruit because it's bite-sized for them too. And so you might say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be eating Juneberries because the songbirds need them. Well, Juneberries will range in size from a few feet tall to over 30 feet tall. The typical one is about 12 feet tall. And so the berries in the upper branches, the songbirds can eat all those, and you can pick some from the lower branches, and there's usually plenty of fruit around, and you can all enjoy the wonderful, delicious flavor of the Juneberry. All right, so now I'm going to show you how I used to interact with this plant. So here is a photo that was taken very close to where my office was before I retired in downtown Boston. And I used to walk to a park on my lunch hour and pick quarts of Juneberries that the State Parks Department had planted there. And so most of these berries I would just eat, and they're delicious, just stuffing your face right by the tree. Or there's one of the things you can make with them. You can make muffins from them and other baked goods and stuff. And you can also propagate plants from the seeds. And I've done this in my nursery, and it is not hard at all. Oh yeah, so there's a yummy thing strudel that you can make with Juneberries or Juneberries and mulberries together. It's really good. All right, so here's what I do. So some of the fruit, I don't eat the seeds. The seeds are perfectly edible. You can chew them, swallow them, they're fine. But in some cases, I'll spit the seeds into my hand and then store the seeds in a little baggie in my stratification fridge, because Juneberry seeds, like a lot of our native species seeds, they need to be stratified. And stratification is just a fancy word for keeping cold over an extended period. Basically, you're simulating winter inside a fridge. So that's what you have to do for Juneberries and a bunch of other native seeds. So they go in a little plastic bag in the fridge, and I should just say that I usually throw a little vermiculite in with them, so you can see the vermiculite here later. And the seeds will sit there docilely in the little plastic bag, but sometimes what happens is the seeds wake up in the middle of the winter, and I don't know how they know what time it is, but their little timers go off and they start sprouting. So once you see the radicals show up like that, you have to sow them right away. They're not going to store any longer like that. So I check my seeds in my stratification fridge periodically, and I look for sprouting. And when I see sprouting, I sow it right away. So here's some of the baby Juneberry plants, and here's some bigger ones. And now I should tell you that in my nursery, since I started doing this in 2016, I now have over 2-foot tall Juneberries in my nursery that I grew from seed and I gathered in a public park. Okay, wild strawberry. This is a species that I bet everybody watching this program has a place to put some wild strawberries in your yard, especially if you have a lawn, because strawberry plants don't mind getting mowed, they don't mind getting stepped on, and it's a great way to diversify your lawn beyond just plain old boring grass to something with some native species in it that are compatible with a lawn. And in any other place where that's mowed periodically, strawberries will do fine. And they seem to like sun. They seem to like relatively sandy soil, but they're pretty versatile plants. So you plant some strawberries, and they produce these cute little white flowers. The pollinators will visit, and then in around the first day of summer in southern New England, and maybe a week or two later in northern New England, is when the yummy, delectable wild strawberries start to show up. And they are teeny. There's no getting around that, but they make up for their lack of size and how delectable they are. And there's, I wish all of you, if you haven't experienced this already, the experience of being in the middle of a strawberry patch in the summer and just having that wonderful fragrance come and waft all over you. In fact, that's where the name comes from, fragaria, the fragrance of the strawberries. So you can propagate strawberries two ways. You can propagate from seed. It is not hard. The seed does not have to be stratified. And strawberries do what spider plants do, is they're stoloniferous. They produce the runners, the little babies on the little shoots coming off the mother plant. And you can just sever that, and those individual babies root on your own, and you can establish a whole bunch of strawberries that way. So when I can, I will share seed with different groups. So I heard about a girls' school out in Western Mass, Miss Hall's school, where they have a little greenhouse on campus, and they do a lot of plant propagating in this greenhouse. So I said, I'll bring you some native seed. And so one of the species I gave them was wild strawberry. So you can see they even repurposed a little clamshell here that you buy fruit in at the produce store, filled it up with the growing medium, sprinkled the wild strawberry seeds in there, just stuck it in a little, cozy little incubated, lighted space. And they got the plants to be so big by growing them that way that they were able to sell them at their spring plant sale where their broccoli starts and the other thing that the homeowners were coming to get. And I understand from the manager here, Marion, that the plants sold really well. Okay, so here's violet, another native species that doesn't mind getting mowed or stepped on. So this one also does really well in a lawn. And it's edible. The leaves are higher by weight, higher in vitamin A than carrots, and higher in vitamin C than oranges. Leaves are edible when they first come out until, technically they're edible year round, but whenever the leaves are out. But I think they're at their best until the flowers go away. And you can eat them raw, you can eat them cooked. And the flowers are edible, and they're fun just to, pick and put in a salad just to look at the cool color. And some people will actually make a violet jelly using some lemon juice that helps bring out the beautiful purple color. And so and you can candy the violet flowers and use them for decorating other foods too, like this black walnut cake. Now, I have not grown violets from seed. You can do it. This plant actually does an interesting strategy, is it has what are called cleistogamous flowers. They're flowers that don't actually bloom, and they're not actually pollinated. They kind of, they come out later in the season. You can't see them in this photo, and they drop their seed asexually underneath the plant. And that's just a kind of a belt and suspenders way that this plant uses to propagate itself. Yeah, so here is the photo from the lawn in my backyard where the wild strawberries are proliferating, the violets are proliferating. And I was able to dig up all these plants from my backyard and them up, and now I've got them in my nursery, and I can plant them in sites that don't have violets. And the violets are so prolific in my yard, they'll fill right in. You won't even be able to tell I dug up any. All right, so that, by the way, so this is, Nancy didn't ask this question, but I'm going to just assume that maybe you were thinking it. All right, let's go back to this photo. All right, so there are lots of other species of violets out there. There's violets with yellow flowers, violets with white flowers, violets that grow in the woods. And so are those edible? And the answer is maybe. So this is why I talk about this one in context of eating the Viola sororia, the dooryard violet, or the common, or sometimes it's called the blue violet, which I think is a silly name because the flowers are purple. So some of those other violets might be edible, but I tell people to concentrate on this one for eating because this is the most common one. Some of the other violet species are actually protected species. They're actually rare, so you wouldn't want to pick any of those for sure. And then I've heard that some of the white or yellow flowered violet species can have a laxative effect. So unless you're deliberately intending to do that, you probably don't want to eat those either. Okay, so all right, let's talk about the Rubus genus. So the Rubus genus is a large one. It's got a lot of familiar plants in it, like raspberries and blackberries and stuff. Here's one you might not know. This is the flowering raspberry. This is a gorgeous plant. It has these really showy magenta flowers. These flowers are 2 inches across, which is really big flower for raspberry. It has these enormous maple-like leaves. This plant does not have thorns. So this would be worthy of putting in your yard, even if you never ate it. And now, what kind of habitat does the flowering raspberry occur in the wild? So where you're going to see it in the wild is usually a slopey area that's damp with dappled sunlight. That's the habitat I encounter most frequently. It will grow other places, but especially if you have that kind of habitat, you can absolutely grow the flowering raspberry. All right, and here is the fruit. And I will admit that a regular red raspberry has a tastier, juicier fruit than these. These fruits are a little on the dry side, but they're perfectly edible. You could eat them just plain, or if you had the patience to pick enough, you could make stuff from them like jam and so on. All right, and here's the seed collection story. So this is why it's good to keep your observation skills activated year round. So I'm like, a really cold day in February. I'm up at a ski area in near Lake Winnipesaukee, and I'm skiing along a trail, and I see these fruits dangling down. And this, by the way, this is another attractive thing about the flowering raspberry. It has this shedding bark like this kind of shaggy bark, which is cool to it. So I was able, from the bark and the look of the fruit, I said, that's the flowering raspberry fruit. So I gathered some of this fruit and brought it home and sowed it, and I got plants to grow from the wild seed that I gathered on a cross-country skiing trip. So yes, so it's added another dimension. I was already picking plants to eat them, but the fact that I can now look for seed to grow plants from just makes it even that much more fun to be outdoors and interacting with all these plants. Okay, so here is a more southerly species. This is mayapple. So where you're going to find this more frequently in the wild is when you get down into the mid-Atlantic area, like in Pennsylvania. It can be quite common in the woods down there. In New England, it's more you're going to encounter where people plant it. So this is another very attractive species that is worth planting, even if you just look at it. Now, I should warn you that some landscapers say, oh, that plant is a thug. And the reason is it does spread vegetatively along the ground. And so you could put a few in and it will spread. So just bear that in mind when you deploy it in your landscape, that plant it in a place where when it spreads, not if it spreads, you're comfortable with that. This is a plant that does very well in the shade, so you don't have to worry about, do I need sun for it? And it likes a pretty rich soil, so one that's got, some good fertility to it would be good. So this is the medicinal plant. I don't know anything about the medicine. I understand it's quite strong. And this is one that actually has had some commercial applications. I think there are actually some drugs on the market or being explored for the market that use mayapple. So it's a plant to give a lot of respect in terms of the potency, the medicinal qualities, which, could poison you if you, weren't taking it, prescribed as medicine. So, so what is the edible part? It's the ripe fruit, and the ripe fruit looks like this, and it's ripe in August into early September, and these leaves will have turned brown and sometimes fallen completely over, and you'll see these little stems sticking up where the fruit is still attached. So where is the fruit on the plant? Here is the flower. So it's called mayapple because the plant blooms in May, and it's in the crotch between the two branches of the plant, and that's where the fruit forms. And this is what the fruit looks like in the lower left-hand corner of the photo. So you want to wait until it's this deep yellow color, and even if it's slightly wrinkly, that's when it's going to be fully ripe. And the inside of a mayapple fruit has a really fun tropical taste, like a guava. So that's worth worth experiencing. So yeah, so May apples are fun. I have grown them from seed in my nursery. It is not hard, and the plants do reproduce well from the rhizomes. So this is a plant that you'll often see, like when a garden club is a plant sale, someone will have extra May apples in their yard and they'll pot up some and you can buy them there, and then you don't have to grow it from seed, but you can. I've grown these plants from seed. Okay, elderberries. So this is our common elderberry. Also in New England, we have the red-berried elder, which has conical-shaped flowers and conical-shaped fruit clusters of red berries. As far as I know, those are not edible. The edible one is this flat-topped elderberry flower. I call it here Ecological Canadensis. Some people think that it's actually the same species as the European black elderberry, which is Sambucus nigra. So we'll let the botanists debate that one. Anyway, so this is a fairly common plant in our landscape. It likes open, meadowy, damp, sunny habitat. That's when you're most likely to run into elderberries. All right, so what part of the plant do you eat? Well, some people will gather the flowers and use them, and a couple different kinds of drinks you can make from the elderberry. There's an alcoholic version, there's a non-alcoholic version, and some people will fry these flowers in fritter batter. And there's actually another flower I'm not going to talk about on this show because it's not native to the Northeast US, and that is, although it grows here all over the place, and that is the Black Locust. It has a delicious flower that tastes like sweet pea pods, and that makes a much tastier fritter, in my opinion, than the elderberry. And because the Black Locust is an invasive species, it's a complete guilt-free foraging opportunity. You can't pick too many of them. And this one, though, I'm a little worried about this because of the commercialization of the elderflower. I've heard a fair amount of hyperventilating about elderflower amongst the foodie and specialty produce store. So let me tell you a quick story. A few years ago, I get an email from a specialty produce store in the Boston area, and the email says, please tell us where the elderberry plants are growing so we can pick the flowers and make a syrup that we can sell at our store. I wouldn't tell them. I told them the kind of habitat the plants like to grow in, but I was too afraid to tell them a specific spot because I thought they'd just go hammer it. So here's the scenario. I don't know if this has actually happened, but I think it's probable. Let's take some chef. He's really fixated about elderflower, wants to put on the menu, and he says to somebody, hey, go out there and pick me 10 pounds of elderflowers. This poor schnook is running around trying to find this plant and finally finds a bush like this covered with the elderberry blossoms. And he says, you know, if I pick every flower off this plant, I can fill this order. And I don't have time to run around and find other elderberry plants. I got to get back to the restaurant, which means there go all the flowers, which means there's no flowers left for any pollinators. No fruit is going to form on that plant because you have to leave the flowers on the plant to get the fruit. So once again, this is what I worry about when wild plants become an article of commerce. So I said to that specialty produce store, I said, you know, there's some delicious invasive species out there like the black locust. You know, if you're going to commercialize wild plants, can I suggest that you look to them, because the chances are that, you know, if what you're doing goes viral and everybody copycat wants to do what you're doing, that's basically what happened with ramps. You know, that the adverse impacts of you concentrating on weeds, invasive species, it's much less likely that you'd be causing a problem. So that's what I wrote back to this produce store, and they wrote back and they said, no, we want elderflower. So I said, well, then I suggest you get a farmer to grow it for you, because, you know, farms often have wetlands in the edges of the farms, and you could put a row of elderberry plants on the edge of the farm. And I guess if they felt compelled to, they could pick those flowers and sell them to the restaurants and the produce stores and stuff like that, if they wanted to. And at least that would decrease the foraging pressure on the wild populations. This commercial foraging pressure is what I'm concerned about, not individual people picking individual elderflowers. That doesn't really concern me. But it's just, you know, when pounds and pounds are picked to make a product that is sold, that's what I worry about. So the whole subject actually makes me queasy. So I have decided personally, the way that I deal with this is I've become a conscious objector from the whole chef and foodie world. I try to avoid interacting with them. When they ask me to do walks for them, I try to find somebody else to do it. I just, you know, would like to be not part of that. You know, my reason why I connect to the outdoors through my taste buds is I like the direct experience of being outdoors to establish relationship and reciprocity with these plants, which you don't get by just ordering something off a fancy menu or buying it at a fancy produce store. You just don't have that. And I think that's a key component to the foraging and the being outdoors with nature, is for you to be there with the plants and do the whole thing and not just be a consumer at the end. All right, so I'm almost done. I'm going to be on my soapbox just a little bit longer in this species, and then we'll be done. All right, so here are the drinks I talked about that's made from elderflower, and this is where I get a little concerned about the commercialization of the plants. All right, now at the beginning of the talk, I mentioned that plants, native species, are important for certain species of animals that rely upon them for food or some other important portion of their life cycle. So I just want to underscore that point with elderflower and talk about this cool critter. Whoops, I just clicked on it and it's going to go to a web page. Oh, I got to get out of here. Okay, so let me see. I got to get back to the show. Oh, I did a bad thing. So this will be cut out of the one that will be shown to everybody. So let me see if I can activate my slide show again. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yeah.
Go back to my slideshow.
Yes.
All right, excellent.
Yes.
All right, I'm not going to click on the photo. I'm going to click to the side of the photo. There we go. Elderberry borer beetle. So this cool iridescent blue and gold critter spends most of its life associated with elderberry plants. So the male and female beetles mate on the elderberry plants. The females lay their eggs on the elderberry plants. The larvae live inside the elderberry plants, and they're not harming the elderberry plants because the beetles and the elderberries have co-evolved over eons. And so they're in equilibrium. But if all the hyperventilating chefs and foodies went out and stripped all the flowers off our wild elderberry plants, then no berries would be produced. And if eventually, even though that doesn't directly kill the beetle, if we began to lose elderberries in our landscape because they're being over-harvested, the beetle would eventually lose its habitat. So that's why I encourage forbearance and restraint in gathering native plants from the wild. Okay, now, this is why the other reason why I tend to just leave the flowers on the plants, because that's when you get the elderberries. And this photo isn't upside down, by the way. This is what the elderberry clusters look like when they're ripe, is they hang upside down from the weight of the fruit. And I understand that you can get a stomach ache if you eat a lot of raw elderberry fruit. But if you dry the berries first or you cook them first, then they're safe to eat as many as you want. And I like to mix elderberries and apples together. So like elderberry apple sauce, elderberry apple pie is more interesting than just plain applesauce or apple pie. All right, now those herbalists in the audience. Yes.
I have a little anecdote about labeling your food. So I had in my freezer, I have a lot of stuff, and I had elderberries and wild blueberries. And I took some out a couple months later and gave it to my husband. And I thought they were the blueberries, and they turned out to be elderberries. So it's not a good night.
I'm sorry to hear that. Yes, labeling is important. Yeah, I encourage that. Thank you for sharing that story. All right, so.
Hey, Russ, while we're on this, can you talk about the stems?
Oh, what about the stems?
About them not being edible. It's always been my understanding that they're very poisonous.
Yes, thank you. Yes. So the good thing about elderberries is, you can break off the stem and go and pick a whole bunch of fruit just at once. You don't have to pick the fruit off when you're standing next to the elderberry plant in the field. Yes, but you should do it relatively quickly because the fruit won't be as tasty if you let it linger on the stem. So bring it home or, your campsite, whatever, in a comfortable place, and then just pull the berries off the stems. Yeah, there's nothing about an elderberry plant that's edible other than the ripe berries. So thank you, Candace, for reminding me that.
And just a trick, if you're harvesting a whole lot of these, if you put those in the freezer for just a couple of minutes.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that.
You can use a fork to get the berries off really easily. It's kind of a cheat, but it works really well.
No, thank you for reminding me of that. That's great. Okay, but the herbalists in the audience are saying, you haven't talked about the medicinal value of elderberries. All right, so let's get to that to the extent that I know it. So, like if you go into these herbal drugstores, natural apothecaries, whatever, you often see elderberry extract products where they're making the claim that it's good against the flu. And I strongly suspect that it does, that there is something to the antiviral aspects of the elderberry juice. And it's important to support our local herbalists and you know, and all that. But you know, you don't have to buy your elderberry extract from Whole Foods or the big chains. You can make your own. It's basically elderberry juice is what the elderberry extract is. And so you can just gather up the fruit and simmer it for a little while and then put everything through a fine mesh sieve so the little seeds are held back and the juice goes through. And that's your medicine right there. And if you want to extend its shelf life, I understand that that's one of the functions of tinctures is that if you mix the juice with vodka, then you can extend its shelf life longer, and you could also freeze it or refrigerate it and keep it that way. So I won't say anything else more before I get into trouble with the herbalists in saying something wrong, but that's what I've heard about the elderberry juice. Okay, let's go on. Oh, I forgot to say propagating from seeds. So elderberries is one of those rare plants. Let me just go back a second to, you can actually take a stem of an elderberry, not way up here near the flowers, but near the base of the plant. And I can understand, what I understand is you can just basically take a stem and stick it in the ground and it will grow roots. So the only disadvantage to doing that is you're cloning the parent plant. Now, let's say you love the parent plant. It's a plant with unusually large or heavy crops of berries, and that's exactly the plant you want. Then maybe you do want to clone it. But I love to grow plants from seed, and it is easy to do that with elderberries. So you just save some of the seeds from those fruits and sow them. And so you can do this completely outdoors if you want, but it is fun to get an early start in the growing season. So you can January 12th, I sowed some elderberry coming up, and yes, so and they grow quite robustly. And you see here, pot, the roots are coming out of the bottom of the pot. And those of you that grow plants know when you see that, it's time to repot something. And so I learned this trick from Heather McCargo. Now, some people will just dump the contents of a pot and very carefully prick out the individual plants and give each individual plant its own home. And it's perfectly fine if you want to do that. But there is another much simpler way to deal with a plant a pot like this. And that is just move the entire pot into a bigger pot without doing anything else. And then you've given the roots more growing room, and then the plants can get bigger. And then later on, when you feel like it, or the plants are bigger and it's easier to do this, you can separate them. All right, so that is growing elderberry.
Russ,
Okay,
I have a question about
yes.
So I see on your little tag there, it says cold stratified.
Yes.
So how long did you do that? And was it moist stratification?
Yes. Yeah. But here's where I have to profess some, I can only tell you what I did that worked. I can't tell you that, storing them dry is fine. That
Right.
there are wonderful books on propagation that I guess if the International Herb Symposium gives me the opportunity to, I'll have a resource page that will go along with this talk where people will see really great books on this subject and stuff like that. I'm just checking the time and see how we do. So after elderberry, let's take our break and then we'll come right back before we go on to the next plant. And so I stored the seed, cold, moist, stratified. CMS is my shorthand for it, with a little vermiculite in my fridge. And so that seed. So yeah, the fruit is ripe in September. That's when I gathered it, separated the seeds from the fruit, stored it with a little vermiculite in a bag in the fridge, and then sowed it. I think this is case where I just sowed unsprouted seed, but elderberry also has sprouted in my seed in the fridge in the dark in the little plastic bags too. Okay, so 3-minute break and we'll come right back and then we'll finish the show. All right, I'm not seeing Jasmine.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay, there you are. Okay, so, all right, let's see what I can do. All right, there's the 5 of you. All right, great. Ready to go?
Yes.
Okay, we're good? Okay. All right, so here is a species that I don't have a lot of familiarity with in terms of eating it. So this is related to the hibiscus, that hibiscus tea is made from, but that is actually a tropical species. You can grow it in the Northeast, but you have to grow it in a greenhouse. You can't grow it outside. This is our native species where the northern extent of the range is southern New England. So this doesn't really grow in northern New England, but from Massachusetts further south. And I guess you could plant it. You could absolutely plant it and grow it in Maine now. But you just won't see natural populations of it. It's the swamp rose mallow. So this is in the Malvaceae. This is a family that is known by herbalists for its demulcent properties. So it's the mucilaginous quality that is soothing to your innards. And I won't say anything more because I'm not an herbalist, but I do know that this is from the same family that has okra in it, and so on. It's a quality of the family. So I have eaten these swamp rose mallow leaves, but it isn't sour like the tropical one. It tastes almost oniony, almost like a daylily flower, if you've ever eaten those. That's what it reminds me of. But anyway, in terms of planting a plant that's just simply a joy to behold in a wetland, this is a great choice. So this is a flower that is about 6 inches across, which is really showy for a native species. And one of the cool things about it is this plant has no trouble at all growing in the midst of invasive species like purple loosestrife. We see that in this photo, like Phragmites in this photo. So, and I've seen it thrive in those areas and not get budged out by the invasive species. It doesn't make the invasives go away, so it's not that good, but it will further diversify an area beyond just the pure monoculture, the purple loosestrife or the Phragmites. So, and I have grown this plant from seed. It's quite easy, and it's fun to gather the seed. You can do it while you're paddling, because this plant likes to grow on the edges of rivers and streams. And so, yeah, so here I am gathering it in August when the plants are blooming, and I found a seed pod left over from the previous season, and that still had viable seed in it. Yeah, so these are crammed with viable seed. You can gather lots of seed in a short amount of time with this one. And that's what it looks like. It's really very, very showy sight. Yeah, and so here's the seed that I stored, stratified in my fridge. There it is, mixed with the vermiculite, and it started sprouting on me. And so I sowed a bunch of plants. With these plants are now, these are herbaceous perennials, but the seedling plants I have in my nursery are now 3 feet tall. Okay, so now let's talk about mints. So those of you that are gardeners know you need to be careful where you deploy mint, because mints are assertive spreaders. And so you're warned, oh, don't plant mint because they'll get into your tomatoes and you'll regret it. Well, to some extent, the wild mints do that too. But that can be to an advantage, let's say, if you deploy them in a place where you want to elbow out some of the less desirable non-native plants and you want native plants to grow there, then a mint might be an excellent choice because it will spread from where you plant it. And one of our great native mints is this one, the Monarda fistulosa, or the wild bergamot. And the leaves smell and taste like oregano. So this one you can use instead of oregano, like a pizza topping, sausage making, soups, omelets, casseroles, stuff like that. And the flowers are populated with pollinators, including some of the rare moths, like the hummingbird moths will visit the Monarda fistulosa flowers. Yes, and you can grow this one from seed. You do not have to stratify the seed. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the mints that have more of a pepperminty flavor, and this one falls into that category. This is the Picanathima muticum, or the broadleaf mountain mint. And this one has a very sharp pepperminty flavor. And this one also is very popular with insects to eat the nectar and the pollen. And including this, I understand, rather harmless, but very imposing looking wasp. This wasp is almost 2 inches long. But it's cool to see them show up at this flower. All right, bayberry. I don't know of any culinary use for the berries. It's the leaves that you use as a substitute for bay leaves in cooking. And one nice thing about bayberry plants is they can grow in nutrient poor soil. Like, that's why you see them along the coastline and gravel pits, because like members of the pea family, have the nitrogen fixing nodules in the root system, so they can grow in the nutrient poor soil, as can this one. So here's a cousin of the bayberry, the sweet fern. And this one is one of our native species the American colonists turned to make tea from during the Revolutionary War era when they were boycotting the British tea. And Native Americans used this plant, and they used it as an antidote to poison ivy. And it's also considered an insect repellent to some degree. And I have used it that way. And the little seeds, they're like little marijuana seeds in these little burrs here, and they don't have a lot of flavor, and I have eaten them. And I have collected some seeds for trying to grow sweet fern plants from it, and I haven't sowed them. They're just still in my stratification fridge. So that's a story yet to be told, if I can do it. All right, so here's another native species the colonists turned to make tea from. This is our sweet goldenrod. So we have over 100 species of goldenrods, I understand, in the United States. And here's the one that I know of that's tasty. So the flowers and the leaves smell and taste like licorice. So how fun is that? So you can make a licorice flavored tea from the leaves, which the colonists did when they were boycotting the British tea. This one is really, really easy to grow from seed. And I found this out just through observation as I bought some plugs from the New England Wildflower Society. Now it's a native plant trust. And the plants flowered and went to seed, and the seeds dropped into the pot. And I got little baby sweet goldenrod seeds the same growing season as the mature plants. That is an easy plant to grow when that happens. So I've got, lots and lots of sweet goldenrod. And I've had my best success gathering the sweet goldenrod seed from underneath power lines. I think because it's sunny and rocky, and the sweet goldenrod likes that kind of habitat. All right, so here is spicebush. This is another plant. Yes.
Hey, Russ, before you go on, how do you
Yeah.
tell the sweet goldenrod from all the others?
Oh, thank you for asking. Okay, look at this leaf right here. See how the leaf doesn't have any teeth? Almost all other goldenrod species, the leaves have toothy margins to them. So look for that. And then just do the scrunch and sniff test and see if you get the licorice smell. And that's there is no other goldenrod that has the licoricey smell that I'm aware of that grows around here. Okay, spicebush, native plant, and where you're going to find this is where its natural habitat is underneath in the shade of hardwood trees, growing often near a perennial intermittent stream where it's rocky. That's where I tend to see spicebush. It will grow other places though, including just in your yard. But that's where I find it in the wild. So the colonists would steep the twigs in hot water for a few minutes and get a beverage that way. I like to gather these berries and use them as a spice. What I do is I dry them, is I just spread them on a cookie sheet and I just allow them to dry at room temperature. And this is what they eventually look like, is they lose that beautiful red color and they get kind of a wrinkled texture to them and they turn this reddish brown color. But at this stage, you can store them in a glass jar and put it in your pantry and they'll keep for years without going rancid. And then when you want to use them, just grind a few up with a mortar and pestle, and you'll get a savory spice like a black pepper, or Szechuan peppercorns. So it's quite good. So the milkweed egg puff I showed you earlier in the show, the spicebush berries make an excellent spice for that. Now, let me just add, it's in the text, but let me just tell you that these berries are high in fat, and the migrating songbirds know that, and so they'll seek these berries out to help fuel their southward migrations. So it's really important if you're going to gather any berries in the wild to make sure you leave lots on the plant so the migrating birds get all they need that way. And it is fun to grow spicebush from seed. So if you want to grow spicebush from seed, do not allow the berries to dry, because the seeds will lose their viability if the berries dry. Keep them moist. So you can store them just whole with the flesh still attached, throw them in your fridge that way. Eventually, though, you want to allow this flesh to rot off and then clean it off the seed and then store it like that. And I'll mix it with vermiculite and put it in the plastic bag in my fridge, and then they start sprouting and I sow them and I get little spicebush plants in my nursery like these. Here is a critical thing, and this is something I've learned through painful experience. I cover almost everything I sow with this metal hardware cloth that I put outside, because if I don't, I find entire flats dug up by inquisitive squirrels and chipmunks, even if there's nothing there that they could possibly eat. Like it could be sweet goldenrod seed and they'll still dig it up because they're just curious. It's just part of their nature to do that. But they will eat a spicebush berry. So it's important to protect it. If you want to keep your plants, put the 1/2-inch mesh metal hardware cloth over your flat. All right, and another reason why you might want to grow the spice bush plant or sassafras is it's the host plants for this really cool critter called the spice bush swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So after the egg hatches, this first instar, so this is about a 1/2 inch long, looks just like bird poop. So that's an effective disguise. And then it gets bigger and it develops these very large fake eyes. The real eyes are down here. These are fake eyes. The caterpillar is trying to impersonate a snake. And then even at the pupa stage, it looks just like a dried leaf. So isn't it amazing how this organism is evolved all these ingenious disguises to avoid being eaten? So yes, so these are showing up on my nursery as I'm growing these plants. All right, wintergreen, very common ground cover, especially under pine trees. You see the pine needles here to remind us of that. And the berries do have the wintergreen flavor. It's not very strong, but they do have the flavor. I mean, it's not very sugary. The berries aren't that sweet, but they do have that wintergreen flavor. And you can make a sun tea from especially these tender, this year's leaves make the best tea. But if I'm going to make a wintergreen flavored drink, I tend to make it from black or yellow birch because it's much easier and faster. And you make it from the twigs. So you basically gather the twigs any time of year, including tomorrow. You could do this. Whenever you're watching this video, you could do it. Find a black or yellow birch tree, gather a bunch of the twigs, peel the twigs, and take the peeled twigs and the peelings and put it in a jar full of water and let the jar sit around for an hour, just at room temperature. And that's it. And that's how you get a wonderfully wintergreeny flavored drink, like drinking a wintergreen flavored Lifesaver. And you can tap any birch tree for sap. As long as it's big enough. So I would say like 8 inches in diameter or bigger, that's big enough. And the sap is even waterier than maple sap. So you have to boil the heck out of it to get anything. And what you eventually get looks and tastes just like molasses, but molasses is so cheap and so easy to get at the stores. My advice would be just go buy molasses. You're not going to save any time or money making your own molasses from birch sap. Having said that, if let's say you were camping during the time of the year, and in southern New England, it would be late March, early April. In northern New England, it might be mid to late April. That time of the year when the birch sap is flowing, and let's say you're camping and you're concerned about the potability of the water supplies, the place where you're camping is you could tap the birch trees and get all the pure, clean drinking water you need that way, because these trees really gush. When you tap a birch tree, go up, okay, so there we go. So you tap a tree like this, I was getting a gallon of sap in an hour from these trees. So it really is a practical source of clean water if you needed it. Okay, and it is really fun to grow birch trees from seed. And the fun time to gather the seed is in the middle of winter, right after the snow. These are the seed structures, the strobles that hold the seed, and these will continue to shed seed through the fall into the winter. So after a storm, go out, and when you're walking your dog cross-country skiing, look for the little flecks of the birch seed on the surface of the snow. Gather those up, store them dry. You don't want to store them wet. Do stratify them. And then sow them on the surface of the ground. They need light to germinate. And then you get your little birch seedlings growing. And I've got dozens of birch trees in my nursery that I grew just this way. And here they are. Okay, so were this a live program, I'd be asking everybody in the audience, what is this plant? Nancy knows. She's got a smile on her face. Maybe Georgia knows. Anybody else know what this is?
Plum.
Yes, this is beach plum. And so what I'll often do with a live audience, I'll say, look at the boardwalk going over the dune. Does that help you figure out what this is? Yes, this is a beach plum. And the trick to finding beach plums in the wild is to look for them when the plants are blooming in May and not wait till the fruit is ripe. Because when the fruit is ripe, it's kind of like the Juneberry. It's purple in color and it's hard to see at a distance. In fact, you practically need to be standing right next to the beach plum bush to see if there's fruit on there or not. So better to know ahead of time where the plants are. And beach plums, they're not large fruits. They get about as big as a sweet cherry. But the flavor can vary from bush to bush. Sometimes they're puckery and astringent, which could still make a good jam or jelly. But other times they can be quite sweet and just about as good as a cultivated plum. So I really love beach plums. They're very easy to grow. And they do not have to grow near the ocean. So here's where I deployed my observation skills one more time. It was in the spring and I'm driving out toward Fitchburg and Leominster. And I see a bunch of blooming bushes along the side of the road. And I said, boy, those look like beach plums. I can remember to check that spot in September. And I checked it, and here's the beach plum fruit I picked from those plants that I don't think they were planted. I think they just, Thoreau writes about beach plums growing away from the ocean. So I think there are places where they find the sandy, well-drained, sunny conditions, and they'll grow there. So anyway, so if you've got a yard and you don't live near the ocean, don't worry about it. You still can grow beach plums. And yes, and there's yummy things you can do with beach plums. Of course, beach plum jam is what a lot of people do. And once you have that jam, you can make yummy stuff with the jam, like this arugula. And there is a yellowy orange version of beach plums. This is actually a subspecies. And I've gathered the pits from these fruits too, and I'm attempting to see. So I've got plants in my nursery that I've grown from these yellow fruit, and I hope that they'll produce yellow fruit, the little pits. Yes, so I store the beach plum pits in the fridge, and they sprout, and then I have to sow them. Yeah, so these plants are now 2 feet tall in my nursery from pits I gathered from, that sowed from fruit I picked. Okay, there are no poisonous species of viburnums. I'm happy to tell you that. There are some that don't taste good, like maple leaf viburnum fruit doesn't taste good. Arrowwood viburnum dentatum fruit doesn't taste good, but several do. So here's the wild raisin fruit, and that does taste pretty much like a wild raisin. I like a raisin. It does have a large flat stone in the center, so it's not like our seedless raisins. There's a seed inside these fruit, but the flavor is similar to raisins. And here is high bush cranberry, which has a medicinal use. I don't know very much about this, but one of the medicinal names for this plant is cramp bark, used to treat menstrual cramps and other muscular aches. And this fruit you can use to make a sauce very similar to the bog cranberry. So this plant isn't related to bog cranberries at all. It's a viburnum, but you can use it the same way. And the berries often persist into the fall, into the winter. So this is a berry you can gather when you're out cross-country skiing in the middle of winter and still make the sauce from those berries. And of course, save the seed and grow plants from the seed. And I've grown many high bush cranberry plants from seed in my nursery. All right, so sumac, if you have been worried, probably nobody in this group because you're all smart, but among the groups where I'm speaking to general audiences, there's usually somebody in the audience that assumes that any plant that's sumac is poison sumac. And that, of course, is not true. Here's what poison sumac berries look like, these loose, drooping clusters of white or greenish white berries, very similar to poison ivy berries because they're actually closely related to poison ivy berries. So, so you don't want to touch that one or eat it, of course. You want to eat this one. So this happens to be Staghorn Sumac, but smooth sumac and winged sumac also have tight up red clusters of red berries. And that's the main edible part of the plant are the berries. It's actually a drink you make from the berries. And I'm going to describe this. So what I'll do in the mid to late summer, when I find the ripe berry clusters on the plant, I'll just lick my finger and rub one of the berry clusters and lick my finger again. And if I get a nice, strong, pleasing acid flavor, that berry cluster is ripe and ready to use. And if that one that I did the test on was good, the other ones are likely to be the same degree of ripeness. So fill your basket, bring them home. And this is what you do to make the drink. You just throw the ripe seed clusters into a bowl of water and rub them like you're kneading bread dough. Just rub them in the water, and the water will turn this pink or pinkish orange color, and that's the flavor coming off the berries into the liquid. Then fish the berries out. You're done with them. Take this liquid, pour it through any kind of a filter, like here I'm just using a paper towel. And then what goes through, you can drink hot or cold, sweetened or unsweetened, and I typically drink it cold and sweetened like pink lemonade. And the entire time it takes to go from picking the fruit to making the drink could be as little as a half an hour. Okay, so all this text just admonishes you not to throw sumac seeds in your compost pile unless you want to be picking out little sumac plants for years. Let's see, I didn't put a date on here. It says 6 years ago, but actually it's like 9 years ago when I made this mistake, and I'm still finding little sumac babies coming up in my raised beds where I use my compost. Now for me, I just pot them up and grow sumacs in my nursery, so it's not a big deal, but you might get tired of doing that. Okay, and a wonderfully underappreciated fall foliage plant. Wild grapes, we got several species. They will hybridize, but I'll talk about 2 in this show. The fox grape, this is what our cultivated Concord grape cultivar, this is one of its wild progenitors, the fox grape. And these grapes get to be about 1 inch in diameter, and you often smell them before you see them. And then you know, this would be like the second week of September, and you smell the smell. Grapes, where's it coming from? And you follow your nose to the vine, find the ripe grapes at the vine, and stuff your face by the vine, which is a lot of fun. So, each individual crate can be as much as an inch in diameter. So pretty common sight in my car in September to be filling it up with baskets of these fox grapes. And you see right here how the leaves tend to be woolly in the underside and usually this coppery color by the time the grapes are ripe. So that's how to distinguish it from the other grape species I'm about to teach you. So yeah, so you can make grape juice from these, obviously. You can make a grape puree from them, which is great raw material for making grape sorbet, grape chiffon pie, grape jam, grape jelly, grape cheesecakes, really delicious. And then here's the other species I'm going to talk about. This is the Riverside grape. And this one does produce grapes too. They're smaller and they have kind of a musky flavor. They're not quite as tasty as the fox grapes. You can still use them for making jam or jelly. So that would be fine. But this is the species that some people that make the stuffed grape leaves say makes the better stuffed grape leaf than the fox grape. And the way to distinguish the fox grape, the Riverside grape from the fox grape, if you look at the underside of the leaf here, it's smooth and green. There's no woolliness to it at all. And so, and this photo was taken actually in Montreal on Memorial Day, but that gives you an idea of when to begin to look for the leaves. So June is a good month to look for them. By July, you might still find some first half of July. After that, it's really too late to be using these leaves for stuffed grape leaves. So here's stuffed grape leaves. So this is a really fun thing to serve to company for Sunday brunch. And let's hope we can all do that again later this year, is have our friends over for brunch and stuff. And, or, you know, I guess this isn't such brunch food. Maybe you'd serve it for, you know, as an appetizer before main deal, you know, when you're having a barbecue or something like that. And yeah, it'd be really fun to tell them that, yeah, these are grape leaves made from wild grapes that we picked and stuffed the leaves ourselves. All right, and I'll mention one last thing about grape leaves. Some of you may already know this, that if you take if those of you that make pickles and you take a grape leaf and you put it in the jar where you're putting the pickles, those pickles will come out crisper because that grape leaf is in there. And I believe that's from the tartaric acid that's in the grape leaves that helps tighten plant tissues, is why that happens. All right, hazelnuts. We've got two species of hazelnuts that are native to New England, and they're both edible. This is the common hazelnut, and the nut develops inside a little husk here, which is about an inch in diameter, and it looks like a little head of cabbage. And as they ripen, you see the husk opens up a little bit, and you can see the nuts peeking inside, and eventually they fall out, or the entire husk falls in the ground, and that's the familiar looking hazelnuts there. Now, I'll be honest with you. I would be misleading you if I said to you, you haven't lived to try the flavor of a wild hazelnut, because it's the same flavor as a cultivated hazelnut. And our wild nuts are smaller than regular hazelnuts. So you might say to yourself, I'm just going to go to the store and buy hazelnuts, which would be perfectly fine. But it is fun to gather your own wild hazelnuts. And I have gathered many hundreds of them. And I'm going to tell you the secrets for how to successfully do that. Oh, before I do that, this has already happened, but one of the first flowers to bloom in the spring are hazelnuts before almost anything else is blooming. So you have the male catkins hanging down here. So once you see those, get up close to the plant and look for the gorgeous, really teeny, about 1/8 of an inch in diameter, but gorgeous ruby red female flowers. And these are wind pollinated, so the pollen just blows up there, or from adjacent hazelnut bushes, and that's how the plants get pollinated. So that's where the hazelnut is going to form, where this female flower is. So all of these are where female flowers were on the plants. All right, so here are the secrets for gathering hazelnuts. First, I'm just going to show you the beaked hazelnut. So the nuts developing here, different species, and then you have the strange thing sticking out that looks like a bird's beak. So all this text says, don't let nuts dry out or they'll lose their viability. So if you want to try to grow a nut tree from a nut, keep it moist. So stratify it or sow it right away after you gather it. And once again, use the 1/2-inch mesh hardware cloth, whether you're sowing it in situ on the ground or in a flat, whatever, protect that nut or it's going to get taken by ravenous rodent. And what I say to myself is, if these squirrels and chipmunks only knew what I was doing, growing all these wonderful nut trees, how their progeny would benefit from all these nut trees out in the environment, wouldn't that be great? But no, they're thinking short term, and we humans, we can relate to that because we think that way too frequently. Okay, so where do you find hazelnuts? As I mentioned, I look under power lines, and I don't think it's the electromagnetic radiation. I think it's just all the sun the bushes are getting there. It's a general principle for fruit and nut trees. The spice bush is an exception to that. Spice bush fruits really well in the shade. But most plants, The more sun they get, the more heavily they produce. It's like tomatoes in your garden. So so power lines are great. And also, especially for the wide power lanes, it's a scary place for a squirrel or chipmunk to be, because there's things that want to get them, that can find them there, like the hawks and the owls and the snakes and the foxes and stuff. So they can't work the bushes as assiduously as the where there's the protected cover in the woods. So the hazelnuts will stay on the plants longer. There'll be more of them. And you want to gather the nuts when they're still ripe and still attached to the plant, as close to ripe as possible. Don't let them fall on the ground, because after the nuts, the husks fall on the ground, you will never find them. The squirrels and chipmunks will get all of them. So pick them slightly underripe. And what I do is bring them home and they just spread them on a piece of newspaper on the floor of my garage and just leave them alone for a few weeks. And these husks will turn brown, and then the nuts pop right out of the husks. All right, and the time to do it, by the way, in southern New England and in northern New England, it's pretty much the same time. End of August, beginning of September is the right time. So when I was working, I would reserve September 8th in my calendar, and I would find some excuse to be out of the office for part of the day, and I would go to some of my favorite hazelnut gathering places in Central Mass and pick many hundreds of hazelnuts. And as I say, you know, I've got at least 100 hazelnuts growing in my nursery from wild nuts that I collected myself, stratified, and sowed after they started sprouting in my fridge. Okay, so acorns. All oak trees produce acorns, and not all every year, because there are mast years. Well, some year they're bounteous crops, and other years bupkis. So anyway, all oak trees produce acorns, and all acorns are edible. It just depends on how much processing you want to do. The acorns from the pointy lobe species, which are called the red oak group, they tend to have higher levels of tannic acid, which requires more leaching. The acorns from the rounded lobe species, like white oak, which is what these leaves are, swamp white oak, post oak, chestnut oak, bur oak, they tend to have less tannic acid levels, so less processing involved in those. So, and there's also a difference in how to grow oak trees depending upon which variety of oak you're growing. So if you grow the white oak acorns start sprouting almost the instant they hit the ground. So they do not store well. So you have to sow them pretty much right away, the same within a month after you gather them. Because here I tried to store some in a plastic bag in my fridge, and the radicals all popped out and they rotted because they wanted to be in soil and they didn't like being in a bag. So you have to sow white oak acorns right away. Red oaks, you can wait until the following spring. All right, shagbark hickory, some of you know this is my #1 favorite edible species of everything, native or non-native. I love to find the trees, gather them, process the nuts, eat them. And so here is the tree trunk. This isn't a seasonal phenomenon. The trees always look this way. And so when I'm traveling around and I see an area of shagbark hickory trees I didn't know about before, I still have those old-fashioned printed DeLorme road atlases in my car, and I pull over and get them out, and I mark that spot with a pen where I find them so I remember where it is. And then the time to look for the nuts, they fruit in a bell curve. So they will start mid-September and they'll end around Halloween. And at the top of that curve, which is like in a September, first week, October, that's when you're most likely to find them. And so the name hickory comes from pauca hicora, which is the traditional Native American porridge that they used to make just by pounding the nuts with a mortar and pestle. It's really yummy. I try to get bigger pieces out of the hickory, so I don't usually make the pauca hickory, but I just wanted to show you, and that's where hickory comes from. Okay, so so there's a nut on a tree. Unlike the hazelnuts, you do not have to pick the hickories off the tree. You can wait till they hit the ground. Don't wait too long, because the squirrels and chipmunks will eventually gather them all. And by the way, you see a lot of these that don't have the husks around them. That's pretty common. Is often the impact of the nut falling off the tree just bursts this outer part right off. There's the penny for scale, and there are these shagbark hickory nuts. And were this a live program, I would show you the technique for getting these open and getting the big pieces out that way. I use a hammer, by the way, and not a nutcracker. And anyway, these taste like, if you've never had a hickory nut, they taste like walnuts have been lightly sprayed with maple syrup. They're really, really yummy. I think they're better than pecans. Most people that know both. So here's a recipe from my book. This is, speaking of pecans, here's a maple hickory nut pie. This is the New England version of pecan pie. And virtually everybody I serve this to say, this is even better than pecan pie. And the recipe's in my book. Here's 3 different kinds of cookies I make from the shagbark hickory. Were this a live program, I'd be feeding you all one of these cookies here. This is the one I've been making recently because it uses maple syrup and maple sugar to flavor the cookie part. And you see it's a sandwich cookie, and the sandwich layer, the cream filling, is maple cream. They're really, really good. Sorry, I can't feed you the cookies right now. Okay, so to grow hickories from seed, I do a lot of these. So I'm gathering thousands of hickory nuts every year, and I save hundreds to propagate trees from. So I've got many, many shagbark hickories in my nursery. And sometimes they sprout on their own, or sometimes all you have to do is just pull them out of refrigeration, give them a good 5 or 6 months of stratification, and then try to sow them. Or you can just sow them anytime you want and just let Mother Nature do it. You could sow them outside, which is how the squirrels and chipmunks do it. It's how hickory trees propagate on their own in the wild. If you're going to sow them in a pot, once again, broken record, use the harbor cloth. In fact, I would consider these inadequately protected. Not only do you have to cut a piece of harbor cloth and stick it in there, you have to use wire, a crosshatch wire, to keep those things from, because I've had animals pry these right off, just like that. So wire them in, and then that'll be good. All right, so yes. And don't let the nuts dry out if you want to eat them. Black walnuts, the native range tends to be south of New England, but they will grow here. And it's a nice tree. There are medicinal uses to the black walnut husks. I won't talk about that, but I know of that. And it is a challenge to get this part off because it's smelly and it stains your fingers brown. So this has been used as a dye, to dye fabric and stuff. So an herbalist might say, you should be saving that outer part. It's really valuable medicinally. And I'm sorry, I don't do that because I'm not an herbalist. I'm going for the nut inside, which I understand is very nutritious too. So that is healthy to eat. So this is what the nuts look like after you got all that gunk off. And now the second challenge is getting these open because their shells are really hard. They will break most conventional nutcrackers. So you have to use a hammer or a vise or a rock, something like that. This is what I use. I got this device from a company in Oklahoma, and you drop the nut in there and then you yank on this thing and eventually causes the nut to explode, and then the pieces fall into the tray, and that's how you get some large pieces out. Now, between hickory nuts and black walnuts, I think a hickory nut is a much tastier nut, just plain, just raw into your mouth. But black walnuts are great if you pair them with honey in baked dishes like this black walnut baklava or these black walnut honey squares. And this is often something that I bring to my live programs because it's very easy to make and it's very yummy. Okay, so I don't have time to talk about all these species, but here's just a bunch of other native species that produce edible fruits, edible nuts. Sorry, I don't have time to get into these, but I did want to at least throw a slide up here showing them. Tupelo, I will say, has gorgeous fall colors, so that's a reason to grow it. And these berries are edible. They have a thin, very sour pulp, so if you had enough patience, you could gather them and make a Tupelo sauce or preserve from it. And yes, I've grown Tupelos from the seeds. That's what the seeds look like after you get the pulp off. And they will sprout in your fridge, and then you sow them. And yes, these plants are now 4 inches tall in my nursery. Groundnut, this is a native species. It's an herbaceous perennial that reproduces by little beans and tubers together, both ways, and I've propagated it both ways. The main edible part, so there's the beans. So yeah, so when these are ripe, they turn brown, and you can gather the beans inside and sow them, just like cultivated beans. And then you can also propagate the plant from these tubers, and I've got some sprouting in my nursery right now. And a fun way to cook them is just slice them up thinly and fry them like groundnut chips. And hog peanut is a cousin of groundnut. This is very delicate, 3-leaf vine, not poison ivy. Leaves aren't shiny. They don't have any, undulations on the outside of the leaf. So if you know that, you can tell them apart. And here is the main edible part on a hog peanut, these little subterranean tubers. And this is a seasonal thing. I forgot to say with a groundnut that these tubers are available year round. So anytime you're able to locate this plant, you can find these tubers. These are a food storage device for the off season. So this time of year, the plant is sprouting and producing foliage like this, using up the food value in these subterranean food storage devices to do it. So they'll disappear during the growing season. Okay, Jerusalem artichoke. This is a native species, but it's native to the Midwest, and yet it was all over the Northeast when the early European explorers and settlers came. Why is that? Because our indigenous peoples of this region traded for it, as we had quahog shells or other things that appealed to the Western tribes, and we got Jerusalem artichoke tubers in return. And it is very likely in patches where Jerusalem artichokes are growing in the wild that those are patches that are or are descended from patches that were originally established by Native Americans. In fact, it is there's probably a pretty good correlation between where wild patches of Jerusalem artichokes are growing and where Native Americans might have encamped. So keep that in mind. Here's the edible part on a Jerusalem artichoke. So we're just nearing the end of the availability of these for eating, because this, like the hog peanut, is a seasonal availability thing. This is a food storage device for the non-growing season. So I would say from mid to late September through April is the time to get these. And then they're pretty much disappeared, used up for the growing plants. All right, so how are we all doing? We got about 15 or 20 minutes left. Everybody hanging in there?
Yes.
All right, good, excellent. So now I'm going to talk about how I put these plants out in the landscape. So this is a story some of you may know. So since I retired in 2015, I'm playing the role of Johnny Appleseed for native edible species. And I've set up this nursery in Weston, about 12 miles outside of Boston. Part of it is at my mom's house. This is actually her front porch where I'm standing in this photo here. And then I'm working with various nonprofit groups, mostly, to plant plants in my nursery in appropriate places in their properties. So this includes cities and towns, state and federal agencies, tribal groups, tribal people, land trusts. So let me give some examples of that. Oh, before I do that, so here is a list I've compiled of the more than 180 species that are edible by people. So this is online. If you have any trouble finding it, I'm happy to point you to it. But if I can get a resource page associated with this talk for the symposium, I will absolutely have a link to this in the talk. Okay, here's my stratification fridge at a messier stage than it is now. It's better organized now, but that's how it was at one point. Here's a portion of my nursery that is now still messy. And you see how I'm growing things in milk crates here? I don't do that anymore because I was not having success with that. I understand that plastic jugs are the big rage right now for plant propagators, and I haven't gotten into that either. I just basically let the word be known that I'm a used pot scrounger, and I'm happy to take any used pots and flats from anyone at any time. And so I bought almost no pots because I'm able to get hand-me-downs from other people, and I'm happy to repurpose them. So like all these brown ones here, that's all repurposed pots from somebody else. Okay. All right, and here's another shot of my nursery. Here's all those tree pots, these 14-inch tall pots that I grow my trees in and the other deeper rooted species. Okay, and then I do sow a lot of stuff outside. Heather Mercago from the Wild Seed Project, she says that's how to do it. And her mantra, which I love, is think how it happens in nature and just try to approximate that as best you can. And so with the little exception of the hardware cloth, that's what I do. And yes, I insulate the plants for the winter, and the snow helps when that happens. And then I also have indoor space where I'm able to sow some things, just because it's fun to have some things growing a little bit earlier so you don't have to wait until the stuff outside happens. And yeah, so that's stuff growing inside. And I won't make you read this, but this is just a list of some of the people I partnered with and some of the planting I've done. So here's a project on an island that's owned by a land trust off the coast of Marblehead, where I've led many foraging walks over the years. And I noticed that there were no beach plums growing there, even though there was suitable habitat for beach plums. So I contacted the land trust and I said, would you mind if I planted some beach plums there? And they said, go right ahead. So I walked the island. These numbers represent the locations where I thought the beach plums would grow. And I determined that basically walking the habitat of the island. And, you know, I looked at something like this and I said, I've seen beach plums growing in exactly that kind of habitat. So I dug a bunch of holes here. And then, so I dug the holes, and then some volunteers that I had pre-organized from one of the local conservation groups went out with me. We were able to walk across the mudflat at low tide to get to the island with the plants. And then we put them in the holes that I dug. And so there we are. And there's one of the plants. And do I have a picture of the fruit too? Yes. So I would be misleading you if I told you that all the plants we put in are thriving, because they're not. Because this is one of my earlier projects. I made some rookie mistakes here that hopefully I know better. But at least 6 of them are growing, and this fruit will be purple when it's ripe. It's just this photo is taken a few weeks earlier than that. So that's that story. Here's another island. This is Baker's Island off the coast of Salem. Part of it is owned by a group called the Essex National Heritage Area, and they like to organize tours out to the island. And so when Annie Harris, the director of that group, found out what I was doing, she said, Russ, bring some of your plants out here. It will give people more of a reason to come out here. So I do an annual wild edibles walk out on Baker's Island, and we talk about the plants that were already out there plus the plants I planted. And we had to add extra time to the walk because now there's so many more plants to talk about. All right, so here is a project I did with a town. This is the town of Lexington, the suburb of Boston, where they had to do a daylighting project because they had a culvert in a park that collapsed, and they had to deal with it. And they decided to just pull it out and restore a free-flowing stream. And so they had this whole disturbed area where they had done the construction. And so the town conservation lands manager said, Russ, what's native and edible that we can plant here? So I gave him a list, and then he went to his contractor. Oh, here is the very rudimentary planting plan I did, because I'm not a computer whiz. I don't know CAD or anything like that. So I just hand drew it. And anyway, so the contractor mobilized and brought some plants that he was able to source from his supplier to the site. I brought plants from my nursery, volunteers from the came. Here's Jordan McCare, the conservation land manager. And we just planted up this area where this project had happened. And I'm happy to say we have about 75% survival rate in the plants we put in, which is pretty damn good, including, for example, this flowering raspberry. So one of the fun things about doing this work and planting plants out in the environment is reading the landscape and looking at a spot and saying, I think a particular plant I know of would do well if I planted here in this spot. And that's what I did. So here is the daylighted stream. So this is where the pipe used to be. So we have a slope, we have the dappled sunlight, we have the dampness. I said, this is the spot for flowering raspberries. So I put it in and look how well it's doing. And if I could read a plant's mind, this plant is sending me a message, and it is saying, thank you, Russ, for planting me here. I'm really happy here. And it's really gratifying to see that when it works on a site. It's really good. All right, here's another project. This is a paddler access campsite to the Connecticut River that the Appalachian Mountain Club and our State Parks Agency partnered on. And Kristen Sykes, who works for the AMC, she helped me plant in a whole bunch of native edible species at this campsite. So now, once these plants get big enough, the campers can supplement the gorp or whatever they brought in with them with the fruits and nuts and stuff from the native edible species we planted by the campsites. And here's another one. This is further upstream along Montague. And you can see the slope, the dappled sunlight. So once again, flowering raspberry is the species I selected for this spot because I thought it would do well in that spot. And I didn't have to plant spice bush because it was already there at the site. Here's a wonderful place. This is called River Walk along the Housatonic River in Great Barrington, Mass. and Western Mass. 1 block away from the really loud, bustly downtown is a quiet sanctuary with this wonderful footpath. And this is a classic example. This bank used to be strewn with rubble, and it was covered with Japanese knotweed and all kinds of invasive species. It was an eyesore. It was a liability to the town. And there's one visionary person, Rachel Fletcher, said, I can turn that around. And she rallied the town. Thousands of volunteers came, and week after week after week, year after year, they transformed it into this showpiece now. It's a spectacular place. It's a place where I lead wild edibles walks, and I have further supplemented what's growing there with plants from my nursery. Here's a project down in Buzzards Bay in the south coast of Massachusetts where we planted marsh marigold along a flowing stream there on the Lantras property. Here's a property up in Maine. So eventually I've done projects in 4 New England states and Eastern New York, and I hope to do the last 2, Vermont and Connecticut soon. Anyway, so here is Maine Audubon Society's main property just outside of Portland, where I've diversified the landscape there with a bunch of native edible species. Here's one I put in spikenard, which has a very interesting berry. I believe this plant has medicinal values too. And here's another case where the plant is sending us a message saying, thank you so much for planting me here. I'm really happy here. All right, and I mentioned that I've been doing partnerships with Native American groups. So here is one. We actually led a wild edibles walk for this group, the Mass Center for Native American Awareness, and I co-led it with a tribal elder, and it was really very enriching experience. And this group accepted the donation of a parcel of land in Haverhill, which is called Pentucket, and then I walked the site, told them what was edible there, and then I gave them a list of additional native species that they could plant there to further diversify the site. So we haven't done that yet because of COVID, but we're hoping to do that sometime in the future. And with that, there's Jasmine. So here's another more recent project I've done. This is Holly Hill Organic Farm in Cohasset, place where I've led a bunch of wild edibles walks, and there's some good plants there. But Jasmine was a good sport and said, yeah, Russ, sure, bring some plants down. We'll add them to the landscape here. So Jasmine, some volunteers and some young people, we planted stuff. You can see we've deployed the hardware cloth to try and keep these plants from being munched to death until they get to be good sized. And yeah, so that project is going well too. And yes, I do share my seed. And here is a bunch of seed from my stratification fridge that was surplus. And here is a nonprofit called Wild Ones. It's all about planting native in your yards and stuff. And so they had a seed swap. So along with other people, I brought some from my collection, and people gather these seed and then sow them at home and are growing plants for them in their own yards. And here's Georgia. So this is what we hope to do had this been a live program at Wheaton College, is in this second part, get out the growing medium, get out the seed, and have people actually sow seed themselves and take the plants home. And I'm sorry that the virtual format did not permit us to do that, but let's keep our fingers crossed that in the future, we'll be able to do that at a future International Herb Symposium. And with that, I'm finally done with this last slide of just showing what Georgia and her colleague was able to grow down at the Connecticut College Arboretum from the seed I gave them. Okay, last slide. So here's this book I keep mentioning that I'll just say something about. This book isn't restricted to just native species. It talks about everything that's edible in the landscape. So invasive autumn olive, invasive black locust, invasive Japanese knotweed I make this delicious pie from, along with the beach plum I taught you, and the elderberry I taught you, and other native species like cattail and black raspberry and beach pea and stuff like that. So this book costs $15, but I don't get any of that money. I give it all to the Land Trust, the Essex County Greenbelt Association, to publish the book, because they allow foraging as a permitted activity in all their properties that are open to the public. And I'm so grateful for that. I just said, keep all the money the book makes and just buy more land with it. So that is what they do. And with that, I'm finally done. And anybody have any questions after that long talk? Thank you for existing over that long talk.
That was great.
Thanks. In another talk you did, you talked about how to incorporate them. Because I know you covered a lot of plants and there's a lot more out there. Do you have suggestions on do you start from a clean slate? How do you incorporate them? Like sort of your one-for-one idea.
Oh, right. Thank you. So, it's a continuum. Can you see my hands? Because I can't see myself. Can you see the hands?
Yes.
All right. So at one end, you have a complete blank slate. You have like a lawn and you're sheet mulching it with the cardboard and the compost and stuff like that. And you're starting completely from scratch. That's one end. Then the other end, you have an intact landscape that's got a combination of good plants and bad plants in it. And that's the typical scene that I work in and that I encounter, and that a typical homeowner has, is there'll be something to work with, you know, like the back of the backyard will abut the woods or something like that. And there'll be shrubs and trees in the edge of the woods with some dappled sunlight coming down. And then it's time for you to consider that landscape and try to figure out what would be appropriate there. So at the beginning of this talk, I showed you that nifty plant finder that the Native Plant Trust has, where you can just type in your attributes of your site and then up pops some plant suggestions. The way that I do it is I just get clues from the landscape itself, from the plants. I have never even done a soil test. Heather has never even done a soil test. So I'm not a strange person. So it is possible to learn a lot just from the plants themselves. The plants are indicators of the soil, because if they're growing there, they're telling you what they like. And so, for example, I know what plants like this, you know, because, you know, in permaculture, they talk a lot about guilds. Well, in nature, there are plant communities, plants that tend to associate with each other because they like similar habitat preferences. To use a simple example, partridgeberry and wintergreen like the same habitat. You often see them together under white pine trees. So if I see just one and I don't see the other, I'm confident that I could plant the other one and it would do well there. Same thing with pokeweed and black raspberry, two native species that grow in the edge of fields. If I see one, well, I should say that about more than half the time when I see one, I see the other already. But if I saw one and I didn't see the other, I'm confident that I could plant the other and it would do fine. So yes, you get clues in the landscape. So another nifty trick that Mary alluded to that I pointed out that anybody can do when you have an existing plant palette and you have a mix of good plants and not so good plants is you can do a simple thing called a 1-for-1 swap, because it's really easy to look at your yard and say, oh my God, I've got, euonymus, I've got buckthorn, I've got burning bush, I've got, well, that's euonymus, I've got, honeysuckle, I've got all these nasty invasives. This is too much, I can't take it on. And so the instinct is just to bail and not do anything. Well, here is a simple action that is very satisfying that you can do. You can do a 1-for-1 swap. Run around your yard, look at one plant that you'd like to get out of there and get it out of there. And usually with these invasive plants, they pop out pretty easily. If the stem is an inch or less, you can usually yank it out by hand, or you can get this nifty tool called a weed wrench, which is like a gigantic monkey wrench, and just attach it to the bottom and you can pop it out like that. And then just drop a good plant in its place. And most of the stuff that I talked about, the shrubby things, as long as they're getting some sun, will do well on an edge there where you're getting at least a few hours of sun a day. So like the viburnums I mentioned, the wild raisin, or if it's damp, a nannyberry, if it's damp, an elderberry would do fine there. Or if it's not damp, a hazelnut would do fine there, place like that. So does that address your question, Mary?
Yeah, thanks, Russ.
Okay, sure.
Ross, can you talk a little bit about how you work with towns and landowners? Do you sell your plants, or how do you work?
No. So the way I'm doing this, and I will admit I'm a fortunate person because I worked for the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for 27 years, and they very kindly give a pension to their retirees. And so I don't need to make any money from plants. And it is so, I have to say, just doing it as a retirement project and giving away all the plants I'm growing, it turns what could be kind of a chore as a business, at least for me, into a really joyful exercise. And also, if I'm just giving away plants and for some reason they don't do well, I don't have angry customers, demanding refunds and stuff like that. It's just, I mean, it's good that there's native plant growers there. I buy plants from ethical native plant growers, and I'm really glad they're out there. I patronize them. I just didn't want to be one of them. And I didn't want to form a nonprofit too, because then you have boards and then you have members and then you have people that, are kind of, you have to prove your worthiness. And, and as I said, I'm being very unscientific in what I'm doing. And so, I don't claim to be doing true ecological restoration. What I'm doing is I'm further diversifying sites with edible native species that are appropriate to where they're going in. So only in a situation where somebody doesn't feel really strongly about, it's got to be native to this county. For those people, I would stick to whatever parameters they establish in that rule. Some towns say it has to be native to this town or else we can't grow it. That's fine. Other people say, I'd love a pawpaw, even if a pawpaw isn't, naturally occurring in Southern New England, that's what they want. And I have them in my nursery, I worked for the Mass Fish and Game Department for 27 years, and I was involved in the land trust world before then and during that. And so I have a tremendous amount of contacts from when I was working. And so a lot of these same groups that I was working with are groups that I'm doing the planting with. And so they already knew me, so I wasn't some strange person. So that was good. And also, this is, the planting native thing is kind of a trendy thing right now. And I just, this is something that this native edible angle, you all know what Venn diagrams are, that's my circle. And then so I overlap in the permaculture people on the edible part, and I overlap with the pollinator people on the native part. And, so for example, a project goes in and they're doing a pollinator garden, and a lot of the plants they're planting aren't edible. That's fine with me. I'll contribute the edible ones to the pollinator garden. So mostly whatever parameters the partnering group I'm working with have on a project, I'll comply with them. And every once in a while, I'll push back where I feel that I need to, but it happens very rarely. So in the case of Baker's Island, the island in Salem, that's owned by the Essex National Heritage Area, and I mentioned Annie Harris. So Annie Harris said, that plant that you make that delicious fruit leather from, can you plant that out here? It's autumn olive. I said, no, Annie, I can't plant that out there. Sorry. It happens that there's the island that's just a few miles away from there, Misery Island, owned by the Trustees of Reservation. It's covered with autumn olive. So we could just go there and pick it and eat it. Yes, Jasmine.
So what are the rules that you follow, or what should we know about foraging and collecting seeds on property? So clearly if it's a personal owned property, you want to ask permission, but is there anything else we need to know about?
Right. So asking permission is a good idea whenever you can. So if there's a park manager or, a conservation commissioner. So for example, the sweet goldenrod I gathered, the places I have found it, I mentioned in my show, are underneath power lines. And I went to all the wonderful land ownership data is now online. So you can go to a website for that particular town and find out who owns that property. So in the case of the power lines, I went to not only the underlying landowner, but I went to the power company and I got permission from both of them to gather the seed there. So the sweet goldenrod and the fox grapes and the hazelnuts all grow in those places, and I have permission to gather from those people. And the nice thing about getting permission is then you can forage whatever you're doing, seed collection, foraging, whatever you're doing, in a really joyful way. You don't have to be like looking over your shoulder saying, is somebody going to, get mad at me for doing what I'm doing? And you can really relax about it. So that's good if that's possible. I will admit there's some places where, something's growing along a roadside, whatever, and, it'll be hard to research the ownership, and I'm certainly not going to do it like right there. I'm not going to whip out my cell phone and go to the town's ownership records and find out who it is. No, if it's a place that it isn't, a habitat that's being preserved as habitat, like the edge of a school ball field or a bike path or something like that, there's usually more relaxed attitude about people gathering from places like that. And I should tell you that. For a talk I gave at the Mass Rhode Island Land Conservation Conference, which was about a month ago, I gave a talk specifically on the topic of what are the rules about foraging on certain properties, municipal land and federal land and stuff like that. And I poured a lot of research into that. And I did it primarily talking about Native American rights, because Native Americans should, basically this was all their land that we stole from them, and they should be allowed to forage wherever they want, especially, following Robin Wall Kimmerer's honorable harvest, in that respectful way. We ought to be able to do that. And it was actually the executive director of a regional land trust that approached me and said, Russ, why don't you do a topic on this? Because we'd love to open our lands to Native Americans foraging on our property. So help give us some guidance on how to do that. So in that talk, I have a lot more information, and I'm happy to send you a PDF of that talk so you can see all that stuff. And anybody else that's watching this presentation at home, wherever you are, if that subject interests you, I can share that PowerPoint with you. Yes, Candace.
Russ, what's your thought on spraying? So in other words, not us spraying, but when we're foraging on lands that may have been sprayed, like what's your thought on that?
Right. So let me answer that in a broader way. And that is talk about chemicals and contamination and stuff like that. And how much do I worry about that when I'm picking things? And spraying is part of that. So I do a ton of foraging. And I share a lot of the stuff that I pick with other people, like at my classes and stuff like that. So I'm not eating everything that I pick, I share. But even as much foraging as I do, it's at the very most 10% of my diet. And the 90% is like, going to organic farm stands and stuff like that. So, so it's already a relatively small portion of my diet. But even so, I would like to avoid exposing myself to chemicals and contaminants if I can. So I avoid gathering from heavily traveled roadways, places where everybody takes their dog for a walk. Although, if something's going above a certain height, even the Great Dane can't reach it. So I don't worry too much about that. And, I avoid heavily fussed over areas like manicured lawns, golf courses, places where it's likely they're using chemicals to subdue the stuff they don't like. And on the subject of herbicide spraying. So sometimes herbicides are sprayed just to maintain a right of way, like along a railroad track. And, so I wouldn't forage right along a railroad track for that reason, because they're frequently sprayed with herbicides. And in that case, I understand, because, the railroad ballast could actually, if there's roots getting into it, it could throw the rails out of alignment. You could have a derailment and then have a much more serious chemical spill than, little herbicide on the trail. So, but I also see herbicides deployed as kind of a lazy way of controlling vegetation. And these are non-target herbicides that are killing everything, including native species too. And I question that. So, but in the meantime, in terms of foraging, yes, sometimes plants that are invasive are edible. Let's take Japanese knotweed, for example. So Japanese knotweed is a hard plant to eradicate. And yes, people will pull out the serious chemical stuff to try and deal with it, like glyphosate and things like that. And I'd like to not eat glyphosate, so I would avoid that. Now, my observation is that the plant will begin to show the adverse impacts of being sprayed within a half an hour after being sprayed. So it already begins to flop over like that. The leaves go like that. So you can tell really quickly. You'd have to be basically following right behind the sprayer to get closer to the plant sooner than that. And depending upon who you're talking to, some people will say, well, that spray is really persistent and you don't want to visit those plants even weeks or months later because that herbicide is still there and it's harmful to human health and stuff like that. And I can't disagree with that. So the one saving grace for invasive species is they're so ubiquitous, you can pick your spots. So, for example, I wouldn't gather from the patch of knotweed that's growing next to the dumpster by the auto body shop. Not a clean site. One of the places that knotweed will grow, which is far away from herbicide spraying usually, and far away from any sources of contamination, is along rivers. Rivers, especially in northern New England, where they're naturally scoured by ice. And the chunks of ice dig into the bank and they carry off bits of the knotweed rhizome, and it floats downstream and then washes up on a new bank and starts a new colony. So that's why Japanese knotweed can be a really bad problem on rivers. And so that's a place where, unless it's like in somebody's backyard or a place that's obviously where the plants are being messed with, if it's a place off by itself, I would feel like, the chances of being ever sprayed with herbicide are relatively low, and I would happily forage from it.
Thanks.
Sure. Anything else? All right. Well, those were some good questions, and so let me just point out the fact to those of you in the audience, there's my email address right there. I'm pointing the arrow to it. So feel free to send me an email if you have any questions out in the audience. And here's the link to where to find me online. So I think I can click on this and just show you what this looks like and see what happens. Yeah, so here's my webpage. It's a very antiquated webpage, no fancy bells or whistles, whatever. But if you want to actually, as the season goes on, you can see I'm actually doing in-person walks later on in the year. So if you're anywhere near New England, you might be able to even track me down in person and go on a walk.
That webpage.
What's that?
We can't see your webpage.
Oh, really?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So sorry about that. So I don't have a domain name. It's this whole long thing. If you don't want to type that whole thing in, you could just Google me, type Russ Cohen into Google. You should go straight there. That will work. All right. So thank you to my lovely audience. I really appreciate you hanging in there to the bitter end of this talk. And this will go live during the conference in June. And that's when other people will get a chance to see it. And thank you so much for enlivening what would have been much less interesting and animating if it had just been me talking to a computer. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you, Russ.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, Russ.
Yeah, it was
Thank
great.
you. And with that, we'll wrap up this session and Kelsey can stop recording and happy one.